The house at number 3 Morehouse Street, Willigee, on the outskirts of Perth, Western Australia, was an unkempt white brick two-bedroom bungalow. Its garden was overrun with weeds and dead flowers, and it was in bad need of a coat of paint. It was by far the worst house in the street, and the only good thing that could be said about it was that it made the other houses around it look like palaces. Yet this unglamorous dwelling would become the most notorious house in Australia. In the ensuing years, people would slow down and point and whisper as they drove past it. It would become as infamous to Australians as the Chamber of Horrors at 213 Oxford Apartments, Milwaukee, became to Americans, or London's 10 Rillington Place and 25 Cromwell Street became to the British. It was at 213 Oxford Apartments between 1988 to 1991 that Jeffrey Dahmer, a 28-year-old chocolate factory worker, slaughtered 17 young men, had non-consensual sex, and mutilated their corpses and ate their body parts. It was at 10 Rillington Place in the early 50s that mild-mannered office clerk and necrophiliac serial killer John Christie murdered his victims, had sex with their corpses, and buried their bodies in the backyard, under the floorboards, and in the wall cavities. It was at 25 Cromwell Street through the 70s and 80s that laborer Fred West and his wife Rose had non-consensual sex, tortured and murdered their victims, and buried 9 of their bodies in the backyard. The house at number 3 Morehouse Street was Australia's very own House of Horrors. It was the love nest, torture chamber, and killing field of Catherine and David Birnie, who, like the Wests, were a husband and wife serial killer team, the rarest form of serial killers in the world. It was here that they committed atrocities to their young female victims. The Birnies weren't particularly fussy about who they murdered, as long as they were female. Their victims' ages ranged from 15 to 31. Whenever the Birnies felt like killing someone, they'd drive along the highways of Perth and pick up hitchhikers or other young women in need of a lift. Their victims never suspected the friendly couple until it was too late. At knife point, they were taken back to Morehouse Street and tied up and abused as the Birnies carried out their sexual fantasies. Then they were murdered. The lucky ones were put to sleep with an overdose of sleeping pills and then strangled. The less fortunate victims were either stabbed or bludgeoned to death with a knife or an axe as they sat in their shallow graves in a secluded pine forest a short drive out of Perth. On November 5, 1986, Detective Sergeant Paul Ferguson was convinced that there was a serial killer on the loose when 21-year-old Denise Karen Brown was reported missing. Denise's disappearance was the 4th young woman in 27 days. That type of thing just didn't happen in Perth. In other large Australian capital cities such as Sydney or Melbourne, yes, but not in Perth. All of the missing women came from good homes, and it was extremely unlikely that any one of them would simply disappear for no good reason, let alone all of them. Ferguson had eliminated all of the possibilities of links between the missing girls and investigated the possibilities of secret boyfriends, married lovers, or hidden drug problems that might cause any of them to disappear. He turned up nothing. Ferguson's instinct, drawn from years of experience, told him that there was a serial killer on the loose, a serial killer who had the power to abduct young women and make them disappear. What puzzled Detective Ferguson most was that 2 of the women hadn't completely disappeared, in that friends and relatives had received letters and telephone calls from them after they had been reported missing. 15-year-old Susanna Candy had posted 2 letters to her parents, one from Perth and the other from the nearby port of Fremantle, in the first 2 weeks after she'd disappeared. Both letters said that she was well and that she would return home soon. And Denise Brown had phoned a girlfriend the day after she had disappeared to tell her that everything was fine. After that, no one had heard a word. It just didn't add up. Ferguson's gut feeling told him to expect the worst. He consulted former CIB chief Bill Nelson, who agreed with his serial killer theory. And if anyone was entitled to an opinion, it would be the veteran multiple homicide investigator, a police officer among the most respected in the state. Bill Nelson was the officer in charge of the hunt for Perth serial killer Eric Edgar Cook, the mild-mannered truck driver who had ruthlessly murdered 6 people, and possibly 2 others, in the early 1960s, to become the most notorious multiple murderer in Western Australia's history. Nielsen had brought him to justice and saw Cook swing at the end of a rope in Fremantle Prison in 1964. On November 10th, 5 days after the disappearance of Denise Brown, Detective Ferguson and Detective Sergeant Vince Kadich were following up leads on Denise's disappearance when they got the breakthrough they were so desperately waiting for. They were told on the two-way radio that a half-naked young woman had just staggered into a small Willigee shopping complex and had been taken to the Palmyra police station. Thinking that the missing Denise Brown had turned up, Ferguson and Kadich sped to the police station. Instead, it was a 16-year-old girl who told them the most amazing story. The terrified teenager said that she'd been abducted at knife point the previous evening by a man and a woman who asked her directions as she walked along the street near her home in fashionable Netherlands. She was taken to a house in Willigee where the couple ripped off all of her clothing before chaining her to a bed by her hands and feet. The girl said the man repeatedly forced her to have sex as the woman watched. The couple spoke of injecting cocaine into the head of the man's penis. The following morning, after the man had gone to work, the woman unchained the girl and forced her to telephone her parents and tell them that she was staying with friends and that she was okay. While she was using the phone, she was astute enough to note the number. When the woman left the bedroom to answer the door, presumably to let in a cocaine dealer, the girl found an open window and escaped. She was able to give police a full description of her attackers, along with their telephone number and address. When the girl had told detectives Ferguson and Kadich of the phone call she was forced to make to her parents, they immediately became suspicious that the couple may be the kidnappers of the two young women who had disappeared and had wrung their families under suspicious circumstances. Also, there was little doubt in their minds that the fact that the girl was allowed to see the couple's faces and where they lived could mean that she was marked for death once they had finished with her. If this was the case, then it was highly likely that the couple had already killed, perhaps many times, and another death wouldn't matter. The girl led the team of armed detectives to the disheveled white brick house in Morehouse Street. There was no one at home. Two detectives hid in a panel van parked in the driveway and apprehended a very tense and nervous Catherine Margaret Birnie when she arrived home. She told them where to look for the man. Minutes later, other detectives picked up John David Birnie where he worked as a laborer in a spare parts car yard. The Birnies vigorously denied the girl's allegations. Instead, they claimed that she had been a willing party and had gone with them to share a bong of marijuana. Birnie admitted to having sex with the girl, but maintained that he had not forced her to have sex. A search of the house found the girl's bag and a packet of cigarettes that the girl had the common sense to conceal in the ceiling as proof positive that she had actually been there. But there was little else to prove the allegation of non-consensual sex or connect the Birnies with any of the other missing women. Knowing that they needed a confession to confirm their suspicions, Ferguson and Kadich hoped that under intense questioning, one of the Birnies would crack and at least admit to the non-consensual sex with the young girl. It was her word against theirs. Ferguson and Kadich grilled the Birnies separately. It was David Birnie who eventually cracked. Just after 7 p.m. that evening, Detective Sergeant Kadich said to David Birnie, half-jokingly, in reference to the missing women, "It's getting dark. Best we take the shovel and dig them up." To his astonishment, Birnie replied, "Okay, there's 4 of them." The detective couldn't believe his ears. When told of her lover's confession, Catherine Birnie also broke. They agreed to take police to the bodies that were buried not far from the city. It was as though it was a load off David Birnie's mind. He spoke freely with the detectives as he directed the convoy of vehicles out of the metropolitan area and toward the state forest north of the city. The convoy moved along Wanneroo Road and through the pine forests. Birnie was so relaxed and chatting so much that they were almost at Yanchep before he realized that they had gone too far and instructed them to turn around and go back. Squinting into the darkness, David Birnie recognized a track that led off the highway and into the darkness of the Gnangara pine plantation. About 400 yards into the forest, Birnie instructed them to stop. He pointed to a mound of sand. "Dig there," he said. Within minutes, police had uncovered the corpse of Denise Karen Brown, who had been reported missing only 5 days earlier. With a guard placed around the shallow grave, Birnie directed the convoy south to the Glen Eagle picnic area on the Albany Highway near Armadale. After traveling for half an hour, Birnie guided police into the forest and along a narrow track. Up an incline about 40 yards from the track, police uncovered the decomposing body of 22-year-old Mary Frances Nielsen, who had gone missing on October 6th. A further kilometer down the track, David Birnie pointed out the burial site of 15-year-old Susanna Candy, who hadn't been seen since October 19th. Detective Sergeant Kadich was amazed that neither of the Birnies showed any emotion or embarrassment while the bodies were being uncovered. If anything, they appeared to enjoy being the center of attention as they pointed the graves out to police. Then Catherine Birnie said that it was her turn. She would like to indicate the position of the next grave. She pointed out that it was where they had buried 31-year-old Noeline Patterson, who they had kidnapped and murdered on the 30th of October. Catherine Birnie went to great lengths to explain to police that she disliked Noeline from the moment that she and David had abducted her. She was glad that she was dead. As she pointed out the grave to the police, she spat on it. She showed a great deal of pride in being able to find the grave unassisted. It was as if she didn't want David Birnie to get all of the credit. As they left the burial grounds, David Birnie commented to Kadich, "What a pointless loss of young life." There was absolutely no doubt in the detective's mind that if the young girl hadn't escaped earlier in the day, the killings would have gone on. Psychiatrists attached to the case agreed that Catherine Birnie could not have killed on her own. She just wasn't the type. But the quiet mother of 6 children was totally obsessed with David Birnie and would do anything for him, including murder. She was even prepared to take her own life for him. When he got too fond of one of their victims, Catherine turned the knife on herself and said that she would rather die by her own hand than see him fall in love with anyone else. David Birnie was a completely different story. The product of a desperately poor family, he'd been in and out of institutions and prisons all of his life and was always going to end up in jail for a long time. But no one could possibly have forecast the magnitude of his crimes. David John Birnie was the eldest of 6 children. Margaret and John Birnie did their best for their kids, but times were tough. For all of their young lives, the authorities periodically took the children away from their parents and placed them in government institutions. David Birnie's parents had a long history of chronic alcoholism. At the time of the murders, David Birnie's mother was living in destitute squalor. Her tiny apartment was overflowing with food scraps, dirty dishes, full ashtrays, and broken furniture. The place was covered in dust and grime. She had given up hope years ago and could not recall seeing her eldest son in years. David Birnie's father died in 1986 after a long illness. Catherine and David first met as youngsters when their families lived next door to each other. Catherine's life was also one of doom and despair. Her mother died when she was 10 months old, and the infant went to live in South Africa with her father. She was bundled back to Australia after 2 years and was fostered by her grandparents. A sad little girl who rarely smiled, she had no friends. Other children weren't allowed to play with her, and even before she reached high school, her mind was scarred by loneliness. She desperately wanted to be loved. She would find that love in David Birnie later on in her sad life, but it would drive her to a loneliness and despair that she never knew was possible. David Birnie was reunited with Catherine when they were both in their late teens. David already had an extensive record for juvenile offenses. The only time that he showed that he might make something of himself was in the early 1960s when he trained as an apprentice jockey. But like most things in David Birnie's life, that didn't last long. Trainer Eric Parnham recalled Birnie as a pale, sickly-looking boy who he took on just to give him a job. Birnie was recommended as an apprentice prospect, and Parnham went to pick the boy up at his home. The house was a derelict slum surrounded by a pack of dogs. Birnie stayed in the stables for almost a year and showed enough ability to become a good jockey. Parnham eventually sacked him when he was alleged to have bashed and robbed the elderly owner of a boarding house. Catherine found a friend in Birnie. She would do anything he desired, and together they went on a crime rampage that would land them both in jail. On June 11, 1969, David and Catherine pleaded guilty in the Perth Police Court to 11 charges of breaking, entering, and stealing goods worth nearly $3,000. The court was told that Catherine was pregnant to another man. They admitted to stealing oxyacetylene equipment and using it to try to crack a safe at the Waverley Drive-In Theatre. Catherine was placed on probation, and Birnie was sent to jail for 9 months. On the 9th of July 1969, they were committed for trial in the Supreme Court on 8 further charges of breaking, entering, and stealing. They pleaded guilty, and Birnie had 3 years imprisonment added to his sentence. Catherine was put on probation for a further 4 years. On the 21st of June 1970, Birnie broke out of Carnet Prison and teamed up with Catherine again. When they were apprehended on the 10th of July, they were charged with 53 counts of stealing, receiving, breaking and entering, being unlawfully on premises, unlawfully driving motor vehicles, and unlawfully using vehicles. In their possession, police found clothing, wigs, bedding, radios, food, books, 100 sticks of gelignite, 120 detonators, and 3 fuses. Catherine admitted that she knew that she had done wrong, but said that she loved Birnie so much that there was nothing that she wouldn't do for him. She would get her chance to prove this in the years to come. Birnie was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and Catherine received 6 months. Her newborn baby was taken from her by welfare workers and held until her release. Out of prison a few months later and away from the evil influence of David Birnie, Catherine went to work as a live-in domestic for a family in Fremantle. For the first time in her life, the scrawny young woman seemed to have found some happiness. Donald McLaughlin, the son of the family she worked for, fell in love with her and they married on the 31st of May, 1972. It was also Catherine's 21st birthday. Shortly after, she gave birth to the first of their 6 children. They named the baby boy Little Donnie after his father. 7 months later, Donnie was killed when he was crushed to death by a car in front of his mother. Psychiatrists would later ponder the significance of this tragedy and the horrors of the future. In the meantime, the marriage was not a happy one. Catherine pined for David Birnie. No one was surprised when she bailed out of the marriage. The family had been living in a state housing commission home in the working-class suburb of Victoria Park. Catherine had to look after her unemployed husband, their 6 children, and her father and uncle. The place was like a pigsty. She took no pride in the kids or the house. There was never any money for food. One day she rang her husband and said that she wasn't coming back. She'd been seeing David Birnie for the previous 2 years and was going back to him. After 13 years apart, she moved back with David Birnie. Although they never married, Catherine changed her name to Birnie by deed poll and became his common-law wife. But the Birnie household was far from normal. David Birnie's sexual appetite was seemingly insatiable. James Birnie, David's younger brother, stayed with the couple for a short time when he was released from prison after serving 5 months for indecently interfering with his 6-year-old niece. He told a reporter, "The 6-year-old led me on. You don't know what they can be like. When I left prison, I had nowhere to go. I couldn't go back to my mother's place because I had assaulted her and there was a restraining order out against me. I had a couple of fights with my mom and the police chased me off. Mom has alcohol problems. So David and Catherine let me move in. They weren't really happy about it, and David kept saying that he was going to kill me to keep me in line." James added that David Birnie had few friends, was heavily into kinky sex, and had a big pornographic video collection. "He has to have sex 4 or 5 times a day," James said of his brother. "I saw him use a hypodermic of that stuff you have when they're going to put stitches in your leg. It makes you numb. He put the needle in his penis. Then he had sex. David has had many women. He always has someone." The killing started in 1986. David and Catherine Birnie had tried everything sexually together and they wanted new kicks. They discussed abduction and non-consensual sex. Birnie turned his accomplice on by telling her that she would achieve incredible orgasms by watching him penetrate another woman who was bound and gagged. Catherine believed him. Their first opportunity came on the 6th of October 1986, when a 22-year-old student, Mary Nielsen, turned up at the Birnie house to buy some car tires. She had approached Birnie at his work at the spare parts yard, and he had suggested that she call by his house for a better bargain. Mary was studying psychology at the University of Western Australia and worked part-time at a suburban delicatessen. She was hoping to take a job as a counselor with the Community Welfare Department. Her parents were both TAFE lecturers and were in the UK on holiday when their daughter disappeared. Mary was last seen leaving the shop on Monday the 6th of October to attend a university lecture, but she never made it. Her gallant sedan was left 6 days later, left in a riverside car park opposite police headquarters. David Birnie had driven it there. It was as if he was leaving a clue. As Mary Nielsen entered the Birnie house, she was seized at knife point, bound and gagged, and chained to the bed. Catherine Birnie watched as her lover repeatedly had non-consensual sex with the girl. She asked him questions about what turned him on the most. This way, she would know what to do to excite him. Catherine knew that Mary Nielsen would eventually have to die, but it was something that she and Birnie hadn't yet discussed. That night, they took the girl to the Glen Eagles National Park, where Birnie had non-consensual sex with her again, then wrapped a nylon cord around her neck and slowly tightened it with a tree branch. Mary Nielsen choked to death at his feet. Birnie then stabbed her through the body and buried her in a shallow grave. He told Catherine that the stab wound would allow any gases to escape as the body decomposed. He had read it somewhere in a book. The second killing took place a fortnight later when they abducted pretty 15-year-old Susanna Candy as she hitchhiked along the Sterling Highway in Claremont. An outstanding student at the Hollywood High School, Susanna lived at home in Nedlands with her parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Her father is one of the top ophthalmic surgeons in Western Australia. After she went missing, the Birnies forced her to send letters to her family to assure them that she was all right, but the family feared for her life. The Birnies had been cruising for hours looking for a victim when they spotted Susanna. Within seconds of being in the car, she had a knife at her throat and her hands were bound. She was taken back to the Willagee house where she was gagged, chained to the bed, and forced to have sex. After Birnie had finished raping the girl, Catherine Birnie got into the bed with them. She now knew that this turned her lover on. When they had satiated their lust, Birnie tried to strangle the girl with the nylon cord, but she became hysterical and went berserk. The Birnies forced sleeping pills down her throat to calm her down. Once Susanna was asleep, David put the cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her undying love for him by murdering the girl. Catherine obliged willingly. She tightened the cord slowly around the young girl's neck until she stopped breathing. David Birnie stood beside the bed, watching. Asked later why she had done it, Catherine Birnie said, "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within my inner self. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied." She was a female. Females hurt and destroy males. They buried Susanna Candy near the grave of Mary Nielsen in the state forest. On the 1st of November, they saw 31-year-old Noeline Patterson standing beside her car on the Canning Highway, East Fremantle. She had run out of petrol while on her way home from her job as bar manager at the Nedlands Golf Club. Noeline lived with her mother in the leafy suburb of Bicton on the shores of the Swan River. She was an extremely popular lady, and club members described her as charming and polite. She had been an air hostess with Ansett Airlines for 9 years and had worked for corporate tycoon Alan Bond as hostess on his private jet for 2 years. Noeline had been working at the golf club for about a year when she accepted the Birnies' offer of a lift. Noeline didn't hesitate to get in the car with the friendly couple. Once inside, she had a knife held to her throat, was tied up and told not to move, or she would be stabbed to death. She was taken back to Morehouse Street, where Birnie repeatedly forced her to have sex after she was gagged and chained to the bed. Catherine Birnie hated Noeline Patterson from the minute she set eyes on her. A beautiful, elegant lady, Noeline had everything that Catherine wanted to be. What's more, Birnie was entranced by her. They had originally decided to murder Noeline Patterson that same night, but when David Birnie kept putting it off, Catherine became infuriated. She could see that she was losing her man. At one stage, she held a knife to her own heart and threatened to kill herself unless he chose between them. Birnie kept Noeline prisoner in the house for 3 days before Catherine insisted that he kill her. He forced an overdose of sleeping pills down her throat and strangled her, under the watchful eye of Catherine, while she slept. They took her body to the forest and buried it along with the others. Catherine Birnie got great pleasure in throwing sand in the dead woman's face. On the 5th of November, they abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown as she was waiting for a bus on Sterling Highway. Denise was a fun-loving girl who worked as a part-time computer operator in Perth and spent a lot of her spare time at dances and nightclubs. She shared a flat in Nedlands with her boyfriend and another couple. Denise spent her last night at the Cool Bell Up Hotel with a girlfriend. She accepted a lift from the Birnies outside the Stoned Crow Wine House in Fremantle. A close friend said later, "She was someone who would do anything to help anyone. She trusted too many people. Perhaps that's why she didn't think twice about taking a lift. At knife point, Denise was taken to the house in Willagee, chained to the bed and forced to have sex. The following afternoon, she was taken to the Wanneroo pine plantation. Along the way, they nearly picked up another victim. After the Birnies capture, a 19-year-old student told police how she was offered a lift by two people who she later recognized as Catherine and David Birnie from photos in the newspapers. After finishing university for the day, she was walking along Pinjar Road, Wanneroo, when a car pulled up beside her. There were two people in the front and another slumped in the back seat. Later, she realized that the person in the back was probably Denise Brown. She went on, "I felt uneasy. I didn't recognize the car. There was a man driving and a woman in the front seat of the car. The man kept looking down, not looking at me, and the woman was drinking a can of UDL rum and coke. I thought the fact that she was drinking at that time of day was strange. He didn't look at me the whole time. It was the woman who did all the talking. She asked me if I wanted a lift anywhere. I said, no, I only live up the road. They continued to sit there, and I looked into the back seat where I saw a small person with short brown hair lying across the seat. I thought it must have been their son or daughter asleep in the back. The person was in a sleeping position, and from the haircut, looked like a boy, but for some reason I got the feeling it was a girl. I told them again I didn't want a lift because walking was good exercise. The man looked up for the first time and gazed at me before looking away again. By this time, more cars had appeared, and I started to walk away, but they continued to sit in the car. Finally, the car started, and they did another U-turn and drove up Pinjar Road towards the pine plantation. It wasn't until I saw a really good photo of Catherine Birnie that I realized who they were. Somebody must have been looking after me that day. I don't know what would have happened to me if I had got into that car. Safely in the seclusion of the forest, David Birnie forced Denise Brown to have sex in the car while the couple waited for darkness. They then dragged the woman from the car, and Birnie assaulted her again. In the light of Catherine's torch, Birnie plunged a knife into Denise's neck while he was raping her. Denise didn't die straight away. Catherine Birnie, still holding the torch, found a bigger knife and urged her lover to stab her again. He didn't need much prompting. He wielded the knife until Denise lay silent at his feet. Convinced that the girl was dead, they dug a shallow grave and lay her body in it. As they were covering Denise Brown with sand, she sat up in the grave. Birnie grabbed an axe and struck her full force on the skull with it. When the girl sat up again, he turned the axe head around and cracked the girl's skull open. Then they finished covering her with sand. The brutal murder of Denise Brown had a bad effect on Catherine Birnie. She liked the sex they had with their victims, and she didn't mind the women being strangled and stabbed to death. But after the last murder, she decided that she couldn't go through it again. That is possibly why she left their next victim untied and alone in the bedroom. She told police later, "I think I must have come to a decision that sooner or later there had to be an end to the rampage. I had reached the stage when I didn't know what to do. I suppose I came to a decision that I was prepared to give her a chance. I knew that it was a foregone conclusion that David would kill her, and probably do it that night. I was just fed up with the killings. I thought if something did not happen soon, it would simply go on and never end." Deep and dark in the back of my mind was yet another fear. I had a great fear that I would have to look at another killing like that of Denise Brown, the girl he murdered with the axe. I wanted to avoid that at all costs. In the back of my mind, I had come to the position where I really did not care if the girl escaped or not. When I found out that the girl had escaped, I felt a twinge of terror run down my spine. I thought to myself, David will be furious. What shall I tell him? On the 12th of November, 1986, David John Birnie and Catherine Margaret Birnie appeared in Fremantle Magistrates Court, charged with 4 counts of willful murder. The public were outraged at the allegations against the pair, and a crowd had gathered outside the court. Police checked the bags of everyone entering the court. The holding cell leading to the courtroom was heavily guarded by police. David Birnie was led into court handcuffed to a policeman and wearing a faded pair of blue overalls with joggers and socks. The barefoot Catherine Birnie was handcuffed to a policeman and wore a pair of blue denim jeans with a light brown checked shirt. They stood emotionless as the charges against them were read out. Neither had legal representation. No plea was entered, bail was officially refused, and the Birnies were remanded in custody. When asked if she wanted to be remanded for 8 or 30 days before her next court appearance, Catherine Birnie looked at her lover and said, "I'll go when he goes." On the 10th of February 1987, a huge crowd gathered outside the Perth Supreme Court. As the Birnies arrived in a prison truck, they called for the reintroduction of the death penalty. "Hang the bastards," they called. "String them up." Under a huge police guard, the couple were led into the holding cells. Bill Power, the police rounds reporter who covered the Birnies' crimes and trial for the Perth Daily News, recalls the Birnies' appearance in the Perth Supreme Court as one of the most chilling experiences of his career and remembers it as if it were yesterday. There was nothing distinctive about David and Catherine Birnie when they first appeared in court to face multiple murder charges in the serial killings that brought to an end the mystery of the young women going missing off Perth streets, Bill recalled. They were a rather nondescript, ordinary-looking couple you might find running a petrol station in a country town. David was a weedy little man, and Catherine his drab, slightly buxom wife with a very sour face. Both were accompanied by male police officers. David Birnie appeared first at the top of the stairs from the holding cell beneath the court and looked totally out of place in the majestic Perth Supreme Court. He was already in the dock glancing around at the masked police, court staff, and huge media contingent as Catherine made her way up the stairs to the courtroom. The scrawny little serial killer was mesmerizing enough, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment that Catherine Birnie appeared at the top of the Jara staircase leading up to the dock where the charges were to be read out to them. If you've ever witnessed a wild cat go off, then try and imagine that same hellcat in the confined spaces of a narrow staircase. Catherine Birnie fought against the guarding police officers and refused to allow any of them to touch her as she screamed and spat her words at them until she reached the dock and spotted her beloved David. Only then did she calm down. The unusualness of her appearance continued when David Birnie stood before the court to hear the murder charges read against him, and Catherine Birnie was allowed to sit on a small wooden bench immediately behind him. As the judge leveled the horrible case against him, Birnie stood motionless with his hands clasped behind his back. "What I witnessed next, I will take to the grave with me," Bill Power recalled. As the heinous charges of abduction, non-consensual sex, torture, and murder were being read out against him, Catherine Birnie bent forward, stretched out her right hand, and gently stroked the ball of David Birnie's thumb behind his back. There has probably never before been such a declaration of undying love in the Western Australian Supreme Court dock. David Birnie pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of abduction and non-consensual sex, thereby sparing the families of his victims the agony of a long trial. "That's the least I could do," he told the detective. Catherine Birnie had not been required to plead as her barrister was waiting on a psychiatric report to determine her sanity. She was remanded to appear later that month. "It was all over within a few minutes," recalled Bill Power. And the erstwhile angelic Catherine, who moments before had acted out such a show of dedication, was dragged kicking and screaming and spitting down the wooden staircase to a prison van waiting beside the court. Perhaps she never wanted another man besides David to touch her. Mr. Justice Wallace sentenced David Birnie to the maximum sentence of life imprisonment with strict security. He added, "The law is not strong enough to express the community's horror at this sadistic killer who tortured and murdered 4 women. In my opinion, David John Birnie is such a danger to society that he should never be released from prison." David Birnie stood trembling in the dock as the sentence was passed. His bravado returned as he was led to the prison van under tight security. With the angry mob calling for his blood, David Birnie put his hands to his lips and blew them a kiss. Found sane enough to plead, Catherine Margaret Birnie admitted her part in the murders and was sentenced on the 3rd of March 1987 in the Perth Supreme Court. She stood in the dock holding hands with David Birnie, the man who had led her down the path of torture, non-consensual sex, and murder. Throughout the day's hearing, they chatted quietly and smiled at each other as the court was told of their 35-day reign of horror. On occasions, she would stroke and pat his arm. A psychiatrist to the court said that Catherine was totally dependent on Birnie and almost totally vulnerable to his evil influence. He said, "It's the worst case of personality dependence I've ever seen in my career." Mr. Justice Wallace had no hesitation in handing down the same sentence as that imposed on David Birnie. He said, In my opinion, you should never be released to be with David Birnie. You should never be allowed to see him again." As she was taken from the court, the scrawny mother of 6 took one last look at the man who had influenced her life so strongly and so disastrously. In prison, David Birnie was repeatedly beaten up and attempted suicide later in 1987 and was eventually moved to Fremantle Prison's old death cells for his own protection. In the years to come, the Birnies would rarely be out of the headlines. In their first 4 years apart, they exchanged 2,600 letters, but they were denied the right to marry, have personal phone calls to each other, or have contact visits. In 1990, David Birnie claimed that the denial of these rights imposed a punishment over and above that decreed by the law. He said he and Catherine were suffering physical and mental torture, and that denying them contact with each other was an attempt to drive them into mental breakdown and suicide. In 1992, Major Crime Squad detectives gave David Birnie the rare privilege of a look at the outside world when they drove him around Perth and the suburbs for 5 hours in the hopes that he may confess to other murders that he could have possibly committed. Nothing ever came of it. In 1993, David Birnie's personal computer was confiscated from his cell in the protection unit at Casuarina Prison when it was found to contain pornographic software. On January 22, 2000, Catherine Birnie's first husband and the father of her 6 children, Donald McLaughlin, passed away suddenly in the Western Australia country town of Brusselton. He was aged 59. Catherine Birnie made an application to attend her former husband's funeral. It was refused. Commenting on the Ministry of Justice's decision to refuse attendance to the funeral, the Western Australia Premier, Mr. Richard Court, said, "As far as I'm concerned, the Birnies have forfeited any right for those types of privileges." According to Western Australian law, David and Catherine Birnie will be eligible to apply for parole in 20 years after they committed their atrocities. But it seems that there is little likelihood that any parole board would go against Mr. Justice Wallace's recommendation that they die behind bars. In January 2000, the acting Western Australian Attorney General, Mr. Kevin Prince, said that while the Birnies can be considered for parole in 2007, he thought they would never be released until they became too frail or senile.
At about 1 p.m. on Thursday, June 12, 1980, a Caltrans worker picking up trash along the Ventura Freeway embankments came across the nearly nude body of a teenage girl. The young brunette lay face down on a bush-covered embankment on the Forest Lawn Drive ramp that spilled onto the freeway. According to the Los Angeles Times, she had been shot in the head with a small-caliber weapon. Not far away, another girl around the same age lay dead. She was blonde and she had been shot as well, in the head and chest, but her pink jumpsuit had not been removed. Nevertheless, it was slit up the leg as if whoever had killed her had been interested in some post-mortem activity. Louise Farr wrote in the Sunset Murders, the definitive account of these crimes, that there was fresh blood on this girl's face. Apparently, the girls had been killed elsewhere and then dumped down the sloping embankment. Possibly they had been hitchhiking. They had no ID on them and their bodies were bloated from spending several hours that day in the sun. Even for Los Angeles, it had been an unusually hot summer. The police realized that unless someone reported them missing, it would not be easy to make an identification. The investigators did note that this discovery was near the spot where murder victim Laura Collins had been dumped in 1977, a killing that had not yet been solved. Also, Yolanda Washington, the victim of the Hillside Stranglers, had been killed and dumped on the opposite side of the road, closer to the famous Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills Cemetery. Her killers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, had been caught the year before and were in prison awaiting trial, but such murders often inspire copycats. It was clear that the two bodies had been placed there only a short time before and were in plain view as if the killer did not care if they were found, a behavior similar to the Hillside Stranglers. The next day, as the Dow hit 876 on the New York Stock Exchange on Friday the 13th, Angelo Morano of Huntington Beach entered the city morgue to look at the bodies. He was distraught to discover that his worst fears had happened. The dead girls were his missing daughter, Gina, and stepdaughter, Cynthia Chandler. Gina was 15, Cynthia 16. He and his wife had been looking for them for more than a day, and when he'd seen the news report, he'd gone straight to the police. Despite the family's request to be left alone, there were people who would talk about the girls to reporters, and it turned out that they were drug abusers, truants, and frequent runaways. It was not clear when they'd last been seen. Newspaper accounts made it sound as if they had indulged in risky behavior. The autopsies indicated that when she was found, Cynthia had been dead for more than 12 hours, placing the time of death around midnight. She clearly had been dragged across a rough place after she was killed. Gina had been shot twice in the head, and there was no obvious sign on either girl of sexual assault, although semen was located inside the vagina of one of them. There was some discussion among the police about a possible necrophilic activity. Soon a call came into the station from a woman who implicated her boyfriend in the killings, but who refused to offer details that could help to locate him. She could have been just a crank caller, always an accompaniment to such crimes, but she was correct about how the murders had been done. She knew details that had not been released to the media. Her report that she and her boyfriend had recently washed the car, inside and out, was consistent with the way a killer would act who wished to remove evidence. But the switchboard cut her off, and she did not call back. If she had, some lives could have been saved, and she might not have taken the path she did. It was no crank call. 11 days passed, and 2 more females were found shot in a similar fashion. First, according to some accounts, just before dawn on June 23rd, someone discovered the body of prostitute Karen Jones, 24, on Franklin Avenue. She had been shot in the head with a small-caliber pistol and dumped behind a Burbank steakhouse. Not long after, around 7:15 a.m., the headless body of a woman believed to be in her 20s was discovered nude beside a steel trash bin. The bin was at the rear of a Studio City Sizzler restaurant in Los Angeles, California. Sergeant Al Gastaldo made a brief comment for the paper, and the incident took up 1 paragraph just below notices of a bomb threat that had evacuated a British plane and of an earthquake in the Riverside area of California. The victim was soon identified as 20-year-old Exie Wilson, also a prostitute, and a friend of Karen Jones. A thorough search of the area failed to turn up her missing head. They had no leads as to who the killer was. Then, on the morning of June 27th, Jonathan Caravello went down the alley near his apartment around 1 a.m. He tried to park his car, encountered resistance, and spotted an ornate wooden box that looked like some kind of treasure chest. It had an oversized lid. Hopeful that he had found something valuable, he went over to it. Part of the wood was shattered on the outside as if someone had hit it or thrown it. Leaning over, he unlatched the metal clasp and lifted the lid. Inside was some coarse material, but it smelled of something odd. Rummaging past the material, he got the surprise of his life. Cradled in some discarded blue jeans and a t-shirt was a human head. He could see that this person was female and brunette, and that her mouth was slightly open, but he didn't pause for a closer look. It wasn't hard to see that this was no Hollywood prop. Caravello ran from the open box into his apartment to call the police. The head, which was considerably colder than the outside air, apparently had been frozen and then washed. It was soon connected via the cut marks with Exie Wilson. "We have examined the body and the neck," Assistant Chief of Investigation James Kono told the Associated Press, "and the wounds all match up." The head and body had been placed approximately 8 blocks apart. Inside the skull was a .25 caliber copper-jacketed bullet. Ballistics analysis determined that it was likely from an automatic known as a Raven, and the bullet that had killed Exie was from the same gun that had killed the stepsisters. So was the bullet that had killed Karen Jones. They had a serial killer, one who apparently did 2 murders at a time. The police held a news conference in the Parker Center Los Angeles Police Department, where Lieutenant Ron Lewis was quoted in the Los Angeles Times as saying that Wilson and Jones had come to the city only 2 weeks earlier with their pimp, and both were from Little Rock, Arkansas. Jones had been found about 3 miles from where Wilson was dumped, and 2 miles from where the stepsisters were found. The pimp, who went by the name Albright, was questioned, but was not considered a suspect. In fact, they had no suspects in these 4 murders and would not even make a public statement that they were linked. Jones said that he did not wish to compromise the investigation with speculations. He did say that it was likely that Wilson's head had been placed in the alley only a few hours before it had been found. which the press took to mean that her killer had kept the head with him for a few days. Jones insisted that the purpose of the conference was not to discuss evidence but to solicit help from the public. In particular, he wanted to urge some anonymous callers who had contacted the police early in the investigation to call again. He asked reporters to print that their names and information would be kept confidential. The murder rate in the City of Angels that year reached an all-time high, as had the number of serial killers at large over the past several years, and people were calling the city the world's murder capital. The intense heat wave only exacerbated the violence. The Hillside Stranglers, killing cousins, had been arrested for a string of murders from 1977 to 78. Team killers Lawrence Bittaker and Ray Norris had tortured and murdered at least 5 young women in 1979. An unknown killer was targeting hapless men on Skid Row, and since 1972, someone had killed and dumped over 40 young men along the freeways south of the city. The primary suspect was William Bonin. There were several other killers who remained unidentified and at large, and now the police apparently had someone new to consider. The area homicide resources were stretched to the limit. It wasn't long before snake hunters roaming around a ravine in the San Fernando Valley on June 30th, north of the Golden State Freeway, found the mummified remains of a 5th victim. She was hidden under an old mattress and was quickly linked to the series, which had acquired a name in the news, the Sunset Strip Murders. Only her reddish-blonde hair was visible to those who found her. The medical examiner believed her to be between the ages of 17 and 25, adding that she was about 5'7". Her stomach appeared to have been slit open, and she'd been shot 3 times with a small-caliber pistol. She had been dead for at least 3 weeks, placing her first in line in the series of 5. There was now fear that there could be more victims in wilderness areas that had not yet been found. In another press conference, homicide detectives displayed the box in which Exie Wilson's head had been found, offering reporters a chance to photograph it in the hope that someone might recognize its distinctive style. It was described in one article as a stained pine box, crudely made, 10 inches wide, 12 inches high, and 8 inches deep, with a brass clasp in front, brass ring decorations, and a metal border. Again, the police would not reveal their evidence, but they did admit that they had physical evidence linking all of the murders. That was interpreted to mean ballistics evidence. "We believe the killer is someone from this area," said Detective Sergeant John Helvin, "but we don't know for sure." Many people called the police to say that boxes like the one displayed could be purchased at Kmart and Newberry stores throughout the area. Detectives checked on this but found no other boxes like the one in their possession. The clothing inside, jeans with the crotch cut out and a pink t-shirt that said, "Daddy's Girl," had drawn no additional leads. Then the first victim was identified. She turned out to be 17-year-old Marnette Comer, a.k.a. Annette Ann Davis, from Sacramento, who had a history of running away from home, was a suspected prostitute, and apparently had met the wrong person. She had last been seen on June 1st. The bullet that killed her was linked to the 4 other murders. In the meantime, the box that had held Wilson's head was traced to a Texas manufacturer, Chicago Arts, which imported and distributed the Mexican-made boxes to Newberry stores in the LA area. They had narrowed down the possibilities to a few stores and were working on customer leads. Then the pattern changed. Another corpse was found, but this one was male. The police would not have thought to link it to the series of female murders if not for a fortuitous incident. The male victim was found on August 9th, 5 days after he had been killed, according to the Los Angeles Times. He'd been left in a van that turned out to belong to him, but he was in bad shape from being locked inside during the heat wave. He was blistered, blackened, and decomposing, and his head had been severed from his body and was missing. He had been viciously stabbed 9 separate times and also slashed across the buttocks, from which pieces had been removed. Despite not locating his head, police soon identified him as country singer John Jack Robert Murray, 45, of Van Nuys. The man sang part-time at Little Nashville, a bar located 2 blocks from where he was found. While the killer had removed this man's head, that same person had overlooked something crucial, spent shell casings which suggested that the victim had been shot. Aside from the beheading, it did not appear to anyone that his murder bore any association with the string of killings that the police were investigating. but it wasn't long before they discovered that Murray had not been murdered by the Sunset Slayer. His demise had come at the hands of a woman who claimed on the phone to be the Slayer's girlfriend. She had broken down on August 11th where she worked at the Valley Medical Center in Van Nuys, telling some co-workers that she had taken lives, and those who heard her say this called the police. This woman's name was Carol Bundy, and she was a 37-year-old vocational nurse who was apparently involved with a man named Douglas Clark. The police went to Bundy's home, arrested her, and confiscated what she handed them. It turned out to be 3 pairs of panties that she said had been taken from the victims, as well as a photo album of Clark in compromising positions with an 11-year-old neighbor girl. She also admitted that she had killed Jack Murray herself. Another team had already arrested Clark in Burbank, where he worked as a boiler engineer for the Juergens Corporation. He went to jail charged with lewd and lascivious conduct with a minor and with aiding and abetting a murder suspect. Bundy apparently needed his assistance with Jack's head. While awaiting Clark's hearing, police had time to search for evidence of the more serious crimes of which Bundy was accusing him. His bail was set at $500,000, and he was assigned a public defender. It was an unusually high figure for bail, but the police feared that if Clark walked away, he would destroy evidence needed for a murder investigation. At Clark's workplace, a co-worker stumbled across the place in the boiler room where Clark had stashed the .225 caliber Raven automatics. The worker turned them in, and the police lab linked one of them via ballistics tests to the 5 known victims. Clark was charged with those 5 murders. A pathologist got to work to determine if the same person had beheaded both Murray and Exie Wilson, but he determined that 2 different people had used 2 different knives, just as Bundy was telling them. Commander William Booth would not speculate for the press on the motives for the murders or how the 2 suspects were related, but he was quoted in the Los Angeles Times as saying, "It is believed in several of the killings that sexual activity was involved." He also indicated that media coverage had brought forward leads that were credited with helping to make the arrests. Carol Bundy was arraigned on August 13, 1980, in the murder of John Murray, and ordered held without bail until her preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. The complaint noted that Murray had been killed because he was a witness to a crime, and Bundy wanted to prevent him from offering testimony. Reporters asked police if Murray had been the anonymous caller who had offered important information, but they declined to say. In fact, the media would eventually learn that it was Carol Bundy herself who had called after the murders of the stepsisters. As often happens, these 2 killers turned on each other, attempting to place blame for the murders on anyone but themselves. Eventually, their sordid story unfolded, at least according to Carol, who willingly confessed in detail to police, authors, and journalists, and also in court. Clark had his own story, but it wasn't supported by the facts. As with all self-serving self-reports, Carol Bundy's must be received with some skepticism. By 1980, killers had learned that child abuse was a good excuse, and Carol was no different. She claimed that after her mother died, her father committed repeated incest on her and her sister. Apparently, her sister agreed with this and added that before her death, their mother had often been out of control as well. After her father remarried, Carol was sent through a series of foster homes. She quickly became promiscuous to get attention from boys. Marrying young, she went through 3 marriages by the time she was 35, including one to a 56-year-old man when she was only 17. She went between men and women, seemingly unable to decide which gender she preferred, and was often unfaithful to whomever she was with. At age 36 in 1979, Carol moved into a Los Angeles area apartment complex. Divorced from an abusive husband, she did have records that indicated she'd been in a domestic abuse safe house. She had 2 young sons, 5 and 9, in tow. She had health problems, wore thick glasses, and struggled with her weight. So whenever a man paid attention, she was eager to please. John Jack Murray, her landlord, often helped her out with money and even helped her to get disability payments and found her a job as a nurse. Apparently, her openness and appreciation eventually led to them becoming lovers, although Murray was married and had children. Carol proved to be sexually voracious and was so certain about his love for her that she tried to bribe and then threaten Murray's wife to leave him. This move backfired, however, when Jack left Carol. She was just a bit too much for him. But that failed to terminate her obsession. She became like a stalker, certain that Jack loved her no matter what he said, and promising to wait for him to eventually admit his love to her. Carol always knew how to find him because he worked part-time as a singer at Little Nashville, a country music bar on Sherman Way in North Hollywood. He liked to drink there as well. She hung out at the club, waiting for Jack to pay attention, but he continued to ignore her. However, her persistence paid off in another way. Just after Christmas in 1979, Carol did manage to attract the eye of another man at the bar, Douglas Clark, 31. He was blond and handsome and seemed to take a liking to her. What she did not realize was that in her he spotted a free ride. He knew that lonely, obese women in bars often responded to sexual attention with money, housing, and other benefits. Clark had learned this during his nomadic lifestyle as a mechanic, and Carol was his new target. While he had grown up in a privileged home and had been given a good education, he remained unmotivated and dependent on others. Yet he had a polished, charming manner with a slightly European tint to his speech. He liked to utilize French phrases and to quote from literature. Former girlfriends from prep school, it turned out later at his trial, were still very much in love with him. Another trait he developed and honed was an exhibitionistic response to sex. He liked to record women with whom he was having sex, or take their photos, and then pass these around among his friends, whether they wanted to see them or not. He married once, but that did not last. Soon after meeting, Clark and Bundy became lovers, and he eventually moved in. To Carol, he was an amazing adventure, unlike any man she had ever known. Yet this new relationship did not dim her ardor for Jack, and eventually she became so oppressive to Murray and his wife that they forced her to move. Jack wanted her away from him, but she claimed that he still came to her every week for regular sex. In fact, they still shared a bank account into which she put money and from which he took money. But in many ways, Doug was more interesting. His lovemaking was sensitive, but eventually he blended in his fantasies of torture, captivity, necrophilia, and murder, and Carol soon became fascinated with these ideas. She said that Doug had once announced that a woman who loved him should be willing to kill for him. He persuaded Carol to purchase .225 caliber Raven automatics from a pawn shop and register them in her name. He wanted Carol to bring other women into their relationship for a threesome, and he also got her to entice young girls into the apartment, specifically an 11-year-old neighbor. The girl was photographed nude and persuaded to get into the shower with the adults. Bundy did not seem to think this was wrong. Instead, she later admitted, she did not feel that this kid was competition for her, and letting Clark have this experience with the girl was just a way to please him. It was a gift. They even made a photo album of pictures of the girl with him, that same album that Carol would soon turn over to the police. While Carol claimed that she was hesitant but afraid that if she did not go along with him, Doug might reject her, it's fairly clear from what she did not say that she had little sense of right and wrong. At times, she seemed to be less the frightened female who does what she must to please her man than a female psychopath easily goaded in immoral acts through her own lack of conscience and remorse. She claimed she had no idea that Clark was capable of actual murder, but her version of the story tends to be self-serving, especially in light of subsequent events. When Doug became Carol's roommate, things began to pick up speed. Carol found Doug to be suddenly quite controlling. He demanded that she do what he wanted and threatened to abandon her, she said, if she did not comply. He wanted a sex slave, someone who would see to all of his needs, mundane and bizarre. She gave in, expecting that in return he would be true to her, but he soon told her that he was tired of having sex with her and needed something new and more exciting. He brought prostitutes home, and to please him, Carol went along with it. In the meantime, Jack Murray faded away, apparently relieved to be free of Carol's delusional neediness. By the spring of 1980, Carol said later to police, Doug Clark had turned to murder. One day in April, he came in covered in blood. He lied about its source, but then, on another occasion, Carol discovered a bag of bloody women's clothing in the car. Doug then told her about Gina and Cynthia, the two girls found murdered in June and dumped off the freeway. Apparently, Doug confessed in detail what he had done with the two girls. He said he had picked them up on the Sunset Strip where they sat at a bus stop. Then he made Cynthia perform fellatio on him and ordered Gina to look away. When she refused, he shot her in the head. Then he shot Cynthia. When it appeared that they were not dead, he shot them both again and took the bleeding corpses to a rented garage. There he played with them, posing them for his entertainment, and then he raped the bodies. In the early morning hours, he dumped them by Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills Cemetery. He told Carol about this incident, and she found herself intrigued and excited by the idea of this kind of kinky sexual escapade. She felt that an intimacy had grown between them that Doug did not have with another woman he was seeing, and she wanted to go along on one of his murder adventures. She apparently thought that this would finally seal their relationship. Yet she must have had second thoughts because she did call the Van Nuys police to report what she knew. That was on June 14th. When the switchboard cut her off, she did not bother to call back. It's not clear how far she would have taken this had they given her more serious consideration. She might have stopped Clark or she might have pulled away from the police. She was unpredictable. That evening, she said, Doug urged her to watch the news. She turned it on and saw that another murder was being reported, but this one was a man. His name was Vic Weiss, and he had been found in the trunk of a Rolls-Royce at the Sheraton Universal Hotel. Doug took credit for this murder. The following morning, he took Carol out to a ravine and pointed out an area where he had dumped a prostitute after shooting her. This was the mummified victim, the fifth one to be found. But he had kept her panties, he bragged, as a souvenir. He described the entire incident for Carol in explicit detail, getting her as excited as he was about sexual murder. She had once been a partner in his violent fantasy life, and she had seen that as a sign of real intimacy. She wanted to get in on this. On June 20th, Bundy accompanied Clark on his Hollywood area cruising, and in a parking lot, Clark made Bundy lure a young prostitute who used the name Kathy to the car. Bundy climbed into the back seat, ostensibly to watch Kathy perform oral sex on Clark. She had one of the guns she had purchased in her purse, and Doug had the other one with him in the front. Carol was supposed to signal whether or not she wanted to go ahead and shoot the girl herself. But Doug apparently got angry at something the prostitute was doing, or not doing, so he reached for the gun, according to Carol, and shot her in the head. Carol grew excited at what she had witnessed. It did not disturb her at all to see a young girl die in front of her. She may have even photographed it. She then covered the body so they could drive without attracting attention to a place where they could get rid of the body. They ended up near the Magic Mountain amusement park and left the dead girl in that general area next to some bushes. Clark soon returned on his own to the Sunset Strip. There he encountered Exie Wilson. He drove her to the Sizzler restaurant on Ventura Boulevard at Studio City. She began to perform oral sex when he raised the pistol and shot her in the head. In an involuntary reaction, she bit Clark's genitals, which angered him. He got a bag from the trunk in which he had sharp knives, liquid cleaners, trash bags, and paper towels. He cut off Exie's head and placed it inside a trash bag. He left the body in the parking lot. Then he saw a lone blonde who had been with Exie. Her name was Karen Jones. She agreed to get into the car with him, unaware that her friend's head was in the back seat. Doug shot her and pushed her out of the car near the Burbank studios. She was quickly found, and Exie's body was discovered on the same day a few hours later, although reports are mixed on the order of discovery. But Doug had driven away to Carol's and placed the head in the freezer to preserve it for their use as a sex toy. Carol admitted to a journalist that they had fun with it. "Where I had my fun was with the makeup," she is quoted as saying. "I was making her over like a big Barbie doll." Once she had the makeup right to Clark's satisfaction, he would penetrate the mouth for a form of necrophilic oral sex, and even take it into the shower with him. They continued to use it in this way for 3 days before placing it, freshly scrubbed, in the box in which it was found, and discarding it in an alley. Carol wore gloves so she would not leave prints. On August 1st, Doug had taken his 11-year-old companion with him on a prostitute run. He let the girl watch him have oral sex with the prostitute, dropped her off, and then shot the prostitute in the head. He told Carol he had used her corpse for sex and then dumped her near some water towers in Antelope Valley. Then on August 5th, Carol sought out Jack Murray for some companionship. She dropped hints about what she had been doing with Doug, and according to her, He apparently talked about turning Clark in to the police. That was not what Carol had intended, so she knew she had to get rid of him. She lured Murray into his van, had him lie on his stomach, and shot him in the head. But he was not dead, so she proceeded to stab him until he died. After she murdered him, she cut off his head and called Doug, who helped her to get rid of it in a trash can. The stench in the van eventually led police to the discovery of Jack Murray's body. Carol and Doug were actually at Little Nashville when a commotion occurred just down the street. Carol overheard that the police had found shell casings and realized that they now had evidence linked to her gun. Not only that, Jack's current girlfriend had seen Carol go to his van with him and had told this to the police. Carol couldn't hold it together for long, and when she admitted to co-workers that she had killed people, the series of murders came to an end. Feeling betrayed by Doug's aloofness, she blamed everything on him, claiming that he was insane and that he had overpowered her. In his turn, when the police arrived, he said that Carol Bundy was a lunatic and that he had nothing to do with any of the crimes. She was framing him for her perverse activities. He talked without an attorney for more than 3 hours, admitting he knew one of the victims, that he frequented the Strip, and that he had helped Carol to dispose of the head of Jack Murray. Their nasty demise was as predictable as their relationship had been in terms of the dynamics of dominance and submission. They had performed a deadly dance together, and now it would proceed to a new phase. Robert Hazelwood, a former FBI special agent with the Behavioral Sciences Unit, undertook an extensive study with Dr. Park Dietz and Dr. Janet Warren of 20 wives and girlfriends of sex offenders. While he does not name them, one case he describes is similar to that of Carol Bundy. Of this study, Hazelwood said, "It was more revealing than talking to the offenders. With offenders, you get lies, projection, denial, minimization, or exaggeration. The wives and girlfriends are just like a sponge. They ask, 'How can I help? What do you need to know?' You'll get insights into the offender that you'll never get from the offender himself. For example, what type of fantasy would he act out? They would tell this in detail. It was fascinating." He was surprised to learn that these women all appeared to be normal and came from mostly middle-class backgrounds. Like the women themselves, Hazelwood pinpointed the males as the instigators. These men have the ability to recognize vulnerable women and manipulate them. The behavior gets reinforced with attention and affection, gifts and excitement. Eventually, the men are doing things that isolate them and further lower their self-esteem. All they have is this guy, so they cooperate. Hazelwood identified a 5-step process that turned these women into accomplices. Identification, identifying a vulnerable, easily controlled person. Seduction, getting the woman to fall in love. Reshaping the woman's sexual norms. Introducing her to sexual images and acts that may offend or frighten her, but which she must do to please the man and keep him involved. Social isolation, cutting her off from family and friends. Punishment, physical, verbal, and sexual, which further erodes the woman's self-esteem and ability to act on her own. In short, it's a relationship of dominance and submission, which means that one person is assertive and the other submissive as a means of achieving intimacy or greater sexual satisfaction. Conflict like this reportedly magnifies physical sensation, yet there's a popular misunderstanding about relationships that involve dominant and submissive partners, that the dominant one runs the show and makes all decisions, and the submissive one has no choice but to obey. In fact, both partners have strengths and weaknesses, both manipulate and both complement the other. To make the dance work, they each need the other. They play with the illusion of forced captivity and make it seem more frightening than it actually is. That means there's a continual exchange of power. The dominant person finds pleasure in mastery, while the submissive one enjoys the feeling of surrender. They help each other to explore their fantasies by each of them playing the role that the other needs to complete his or her idea about the desired feeling. The experience pushes them both closer to their most primal needs, which reportedly creates a flow of energy that neither can experience alone. Oddly enough, a paradoxical equality is achieved between the one who shoulders power and the one who is willingly stripped of it. The development of this dynamic is clear in the way Clark and Bundy related to each other. She liked that this self-named king of one-night stands was decisive and dominant, so that once he became really controlling, she was already used to submitting to whatever he demanded, no matter what it was. While the .25 caliber pistol with which the 5 known victims were shot was found in Clark's possession, it turned out to be registered to Carol Bundy. That complicated matters. The police needed Carol's testimony against Clark, but he might be able to throw reasonable doubt into the process by pointing to Carol as the instigator, even the sole killer. She could have murdered the women out of jealousy and then framed Clark. She had, after all, killed Murray and had even beheaded him herself. She was capable of murder. In fact, she apparently had bought 2 guns, which she said had been for Clark. Yet Clark's fingerprints were on the murder weapon and on nude photographs of a child, so he was certainly implicated in something. In fact, the police had an entire photo album that showed him to be a pedo and to have engaged in illegal behavior. He claimed that the child was responsible for seducing him. In many ways, it looked as if it was going to come down to which of these 2 the jury would believe. Carol had come forward, and that was in her favor, although it's also true that when psychopaths feel the heat, they often turn on their cohorts as a way to get the best deal for themselves. Coming forward first is no measure of honesty. Clark had already manufactured his own story for everything. He was saying that Carol, whose last name was Bundy, imagined herself to be the wife of Ted Bundy, the infamous nomadic serial killer who had been arrested in Florida in 1979 and had committed countless murders across the country. She had engaged Jack Murray in this delusion, and they had killed the victims together before Carol had finally turned her wrath on Jack. But the police soon collected more physical evidence that pointed to Clark. They went to Clark's rented garage and found a bloody boot print that matched one of his boots, not Jack Murray's, which they had confiscated. They also found blood in a car that he had sold that was matched to some of the victims, and they located the kill bag that Carol had described, and the gloves she had worn to handle the box with Wilson's head. They also had a clipping about Exie Wilson's murder in Doug's bedroom at Carol's apartment, along with some disturbing pornography. Inside Doug's wallet, they found a list of names, Cindy and Mindy, and some phone numbers. Mindy, they had learned, had been an acquaintance of Cynthia Chandler. She had reported to police that after Cynthia's murder, someone had called her. First, he'd imitated a police officer, and then he had called back and said he'd killed Cynthia and would do the same to her. The detectives had a tape of Doug's voice from his confession. They went to find Mindy. She identified it as the voice of the man who had called her. In the meantime, another team had found alibis for Jack Murray for 3 of the murders, so Clark's attempt to throw it all onto a dead man was proving futile. Then, on August 26th, the remains of the woman that Doug Clark had allegedly dumped near the water tower at the amusement park were found. The bullet in her skull was linked to the same raven that had killed 5 others. Then another set of remains was found of a blonde woman near Malibu, which was never identified. Carol claimed that Doug had told her about killing and dumping this prostitute. She had been shot, but the bullet was too fragmented to be definitely linked to the others. Yet despite Carol's description, searchers did not locate Kathy, the prostitute that Carol said she had seen Doug shoot right in front of her. This woman would eventually be located, but not until March 1981, at which time Carol was charged with 2 murders. Carol did tell detectives that she had heard through the prison grapevine about a prostitute who was nearly killed by a John, and this sounded like the attack that Doug had once recovered from and admitted to her. Her name was Charlene Anderman, and she picked Clark out of a photo spread as the man who had nearly killed her with a knife. On top of everything else, Doug was charged with attempted murder. Both Bundy and Clark were subjected to several batteries of psychological examinations. Carol was described by one professional as condescending and controlling, ready to blame others. She was not brain damaged and showed no overt psychopathology. Doug, too, was not organically damaged or considered in any way psychotic enough to be judged insane. He had numerous personality and psychosexual disorders, to be sure, but nothing that would provide an excuse for what he had allegedly done. So his trial procedure moved forward, and he sat in the same jail as Angelo Buono, Roy Norris, William Bonin, arrested for the freeway killings, and an assortment of other serial killers. Through them, he saw exactly what kind of person he was. Not that it mattered. He thought he was better than everyone else, an attitude that would not help him at his trial. Clark wrote a press statement based on Carol's arrest report, but switched names and incidents around to make her and Jack Murray look like the guilty parties. He insisted that all of the evidence pointed to her. Yet at his preliminary hearing on November 14, 1980, Mindy Cohen testified that Clark had told her over the phone in July that he had killed 2 of the victims, the stepsisters, and had then had sex with their corpses. It was not an admission, she said, so much as a threat. She testified that he had told her he wanted to do the same thing to her. He also told her that he had shot the girls in both the head and the heart. He did not identify himself, she said, but she later recognized his voice from a tape that police played for her. The taped voice was indeed Douglas Clark's, and he had said during his 3+ hours of confession that Carol Bundy was his roommate and that she had killed her boyfriend, Jack Murray, because he knew too much about the other murders. He admitted that he had helped her to dispose of Murray's decapitated head. Mindy's testimony was supported by phone records that indicated that someone had called her twice from Clark's apartment, and police had found her phone number in his wallet. The first time he had posed as a detective, the second time as the killer. Clark admitted that he made the calls, but insisted that he had identified himself with his real name. He believed that this indicated that he was innocent. Clark was held for pre-trial motions set for December. Because of special circumstances in the murders, he faced the death penalty. He began at once to accuse the police of planting evidence and faking the tape of his voice, and he proceeded to show fault with a succession of lawyers that the court imposed. He accused everyone involved of being dishonest, and he attempted to find ways of discrediting Carol. He even suggested that the blood of a victim found on one of his paintings from the rented garage had been refrigerated for the purpose of framing him. One of his plans for undermining was rather ludicrous. He had learned that Veronica Compton was in the same prison as Carol. Veronica had tried to win hillside strangler Kenneth Bianchi's love by following his plan for her to strangle a woman in Washington state and plant his semen on her. That way, he could prove that he had not been the murderer of 2 women there earlier that year. But Compton had failed in her mission and been arrested and imprisoned for the attempted murder. Bianchi had turned his back on her, but Clark saw an opportunity. He wooed her himself and hoped to use her via his flowery letters and a valentine decorated with a headless female corpse to get at Carol. He also assured her that he would be out of prison by August of the following year. When a Washington jury convicted her, he sent her a rose. He hoped he could win her into helping him to frame Carol. The trial began in October 1982 before a jury of 8 women and 4 men. The event drew large crowds of journalists, television reporters, and onlookers, including Peter Falk, the actor who played TV Detective Columbo. It took 4 months to complete all the testimony, which Deputy District Attorney Robert Jorgensen described as an intimate tour of a sewer. Doug Clark was charged in the murders of 6 women, ages 15 to 24. All had been shot in the head with the same gun. For another potential victim, the bullet was too disintegrated to make a definite match. Jorgensen called Clark a cowardly butcher of little girls and a necrophiliac, but the defense portrayed him as an articulate, intelligent man against whom the evidence was only circumstantial. Clark himself undermined this by acting arrogant, calling the court officers names, and disrupting the proceedings with temper tantrums. Expert witnesses testified that 3 of the victims had been sexually assaulted, but could not tell whether this had happened pre- or post-mortem. The prosecution had letters from Clark in which he described his interest in necrophilia to back up their assertions about that aspect of his behavior. While they hoped with this association to show his depraved nature, they also had good physical evidence of the murders themselves. During part of the trial, Clark served as his own attorney, with court-appointed lawyers Maxwell Keith and Penelope Watson as his legal consultants. He despised Keith, but liked Watson. During his stay in prison over the past 2 years, Clark had studied law books and wanted to handle things himself. The judge was not so sure, but allowed it for a period of time. Attorney Keith pointed out that Clark had voluntarily given blood samples and cooperated with authorities with interviews and information. It's not something a responsible person would do if his life was in danger, he said, but most of his efforts were thwarted by Clark's assertions and behaviors. Like many narcissists, he failed to see how he was coming across. Charlene Anderman was first on the stand in terms of the lineup of victims, because according to Carol's report, she had been the first one attacked. However, her testimony was not very strong due to mistaken identifications and conflicts in her story. She also had been hypnotized to refresh her memory of the incident, and this became a point of contention since such evidence had been ruled inadmissible in California. Then the victim stories were recounted, with the aid of witnesses and relatives. The evidence to implicate Clark was presented. Clark tripped himself up after a waitress, Danielle Patton, broke down in tears as she described how her fear of him had forced her to move. In what could be construed as a veiled threat, he told her he knew her new home address. He obviously could not resist showing off his sense of power over her, but it did not help his case. Calling Judge Ricardo Torres a gutless worm, among many other vulgar names, got Clark's attorney privileges suspended. Keith and Watson were told to take over. The chief witness against Clark, but ironically called by the defense at his behest, was Carol Bundy, who had been promised use immunity in those murders, but not her own. What she said could not be used at her trial. She had dressed like a prim and proper housewife, and she spoke articulately about being under Clark's spell. She talked about how Doug had brought home the head of one victim, and said that he had bragged about committing murders since he was 17, to the tune of about 47. She admitted to having played with the head and applied cosmetics to make it more appealing as a sex toy. Although she claimed to be a compulsive truth-teller, she undermined herself with a letter she had written explicitly stating that she could not be trusted to tell the truth. Other letters also showed her to be aware of just how to leave an impression on the jury. She, in fact, began to sound like the mastermind herself rather than someone under the master's spell. In January, Veronica Compton was brought in as a witness, even as the trial of the Hillside Stranglers, Bianchi and Buono, was happening across the hall. Clark had hoped to get her to say that Carol had confessed to everything. That was the point of his concerted wooing efforts, but she pleaded the fifth and would not talk. That disappointed the media. In the end, Clark had no real case, and he had failed to destroy the prosecution as he had promised. As inept as he claimed they were, they managed to lay out a compelling argument that he was a vile sexual predator and serial killer. On January 28th, according to the newspapers, after the jury deliberated for 5 days, Clark was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder in his attack on Anderman. When the verdict was announced, Clark looked at his mother and mouthed, "Hi, Mom." He kept insisting he was innocent, but nevertheless, when he took the stand to once again display his arrogant attitude, he urged the court to sentence him to die in the gas chamber. They were willing to oblige. On March 16, 1988, Douglas Clark received 6 death sentences, and he currently serves his time at San Quentin, trying to get an attorney to listen to his case and get him a new trial. He also married a woman named Kelly Keniston, who helped him in his crusade to prove his innocence. During Carol's initial confession to the police, she took the opportunity to make a sexual invitation to the detective who was questioning her. This disturbing behavior did not help her to gain any sympathy. She seemed altogether pathetic, needy, and unaware of the reality of her situation. Yet she had been needed in the case against Doug, so the detectives had tried to overlook her ploys. She even sent the judge from Clark's trial a suggestive Christmas card. Carol Bundy had long considered pleading not guilty by reason of insanity in the murder of John Murray and in assisting in the murder of an unidentified prostitute, the Kathy murder. Then she backed away from that approach, and moments before her trial was to begin on May 2, 1983, she admitted that she had killed Murray because he suspected Clark of the Sunset slayings, and she was afraid he would turn Clark in. She had lured him to his van at midnight one night with the promise of sex and had killed him there by shooting him in the head. With a boning knife, she had removed his head to prevent anyone from finding the bullet and linking it to the other murders. During her original confession, Bundy had told police officers, "It was really fun to do." She had likened it to an amusement park ride and said she would probably do it again. Now she was backing away from that sentiment, aware of how it made her look. She accepted a plea deal that spared her from the death penalty. On May 31st, she received consecutive prison terms of 25 years to life on the count of participating in the murder of one of Clark's victims, and 27 years to life on the murder of Murray and the illegal use of a gun. She was sent to the California Institution for Women at Frontera. Doug Clark continued to insist on his innocence. He wrote a court petition for a new trial, but it was dismissed. He continues to seek a lawyer who will defend him more ably than he claims his string of fired lawyers have done. In June 1992, the California Supreme Court affirmed his death penalty. When prison reform activist Jennifer Furio put together a collection of her correspondences with serial killers, published in 1998, Doug Clark was among her correspondents, and she printed a selection of his letters to her from a 2-year period. In her preface, she indicates that Clark claims to be innocent. Indeed, his first letter reiterates how he was framed by Carol Bundy and her boyfriend, Jack Murray. He insists that a DNA analysis of the biological evidence will exonerate him. He denies having been Carol Bundy's lover. At best, they were casual acquaintances. He calls Carol a sadistic lesbian serial killer. He also notes that Furio's project may just be a way for her to get vicarious thrills. In these letters, his sentences are erratic, and he never fails to add some sexual content to try to draw Furio into giving him a thrill. There's no doubt that he likes lesbians, and he hints that she might want to try that. He also never fails to mention that it's impossible to prove that he is guilty of the murders, and that he expects a retrial to happen very soon. After her book was published, Furio wrote in her next book on team killers about how she went on a talk show, and Clark called in. "Douglas is incredibly tricky," she wrote. She went on to say that he had portrayed himself in his letters as an honestly lustful man, not an unstable, repressed person like Carol Bundy. Because she kept secrets about her deviant sex life, she's logically the killer, not him. Being out of touch with her needs led to the kind of anger it takes to murder people so brutally. Yet when he called into the talk show, he claimed that he'd given Furio details to excite her lonely existence. She was just like Carol. But Furio had the last word, as she reframed his ideas as manipulations and his ruse as one of his many masks. She then tried to enlist Carol Bundy in her attempt to understand team killers, but Carol did not cooperate. Furio dismissed her as emotionally dissipated. In the end, she decided that Clark was guilty and had manipulated Carol through her instability and desperation to be loved. Exactly what Carol may well have manipulated many people to believe. Larry King devoted a show to the murders in 1992, in which he interviewed witness Mindy Cohen, author Louise Farr, and author Mark McNamara, who argued in an article for Vanity Fair that Clark may be innocent of the charges. He claimed that there were only 3 pieces of actual evidence against Clark: the fact that the gun was found in his workplace, Bundy's testimony, and the testimony of a woman who claimed that Clark had once attacked her. He believed each piece, when closely examined, fell apart. It was his contention that the trial did not establish Clark as a killer. Farr accused him of being a mere mouthpiece and alter ego for Clark. Nothing was resolved on this show. Freed serial killer Nico Clough wrote to both Clark and Bundy and received a postcard from Carol in 1995 to the effect that she was going blind. She also could not afford stamps to France, where he lived, so she declined to engage in an ongoing correspondence with him. She thanked him and wished him a happy new year. He posted the letter online with several photos of the crime scenes from the Sunset Slayers. Michael and C.L. Kelleher indicate that there is some belief that Bundy and Clark were responsible for many more murders than those with which they were charged, possibly as many as 50, probably based on Bundy's testimony about 47. They maintain, probably correctly, that the true relationship between these two may never be known. Those who have spent time with them claim they are both manipulative. Louise Farr, a magazine writer, is the only person to have gone through the 52 volumes of courtroom transcripts, and to have tracked down many people involved, including Clark and Bundy. She commented that researching these crimes had an emotional impact on how she now views violence. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, she said, "Crimes like these reverberate outward and the circle keeps getting bigger and bigger." Bundy died in prison from heart failure on December 9, 2003, at the age of 61. And Clark, well, Clark is probably still confident he will be released soon. He is now 75 years old.
"I'm no average killer," Raymond Martinez Fernandez told Michigan cops on the day he was arrested. The slim, smartly dressed balding man sat in the wooden chair between two detectives as he told a tawdry story of sex, lies, and murder. He wiped his sweating forehead every few minutes with a white handkerchief supplied by his co-conspirator, an obese sex slave, who looked on with wide-eyed admiration and love. For several hours, he described their journey through a maze of deception and betrayal that ended with the deaths of as many as 17 women. "I have a way with women, a power over them," he said. That power, he claimed, was achieved by the practice of voodoo. Raymond Martinez Fernandez, 34, was born in Hawaii to Spanish parents. His rotund girlfriend, Martha Julie Beck, 29, who weighed well over 200 pounds, lovingly brushed his thinning hair back on his head as he told police how they killed their last victims in the town of Byron Center, Michigan, on the night of February 28, 1949. Later, when the victim's 2-year-old daughter refused to stop crying over the loss of her mother, Martha drowned her in a tub of dirty water while Raymond looked on. After the murders, they decided to go to the movies where they munched on popcorn and drank a gallon of soda. The day-by-day revelations about this bizarre couple had New York City's press working overtime to keep up with a story that seemed too sleazy even by tabloid standards. Martha's enormous size was the subject of never-ending speculation by the press, who estimated her weight to be anywhere from 200 to over 300 pounds. This constant ridicule caused Martha to write a series of tearful, angry letters from prison to the media, complaining of the unfair treatment she received from columnists like Walter Winchell and newspapers like the Daily News and the New York Mirror. "I'm still a human, feeling every blow inside, even though I have the ability to hide my feelings and laugh," she said. "But that doesn't say my heart isn't breaking from the insults and humiliation of being talked about as I am. Oh yes, I wear a cloak of laughter." Fernandez and Beck came to be known as the Lonely Hearts Killers in the nation's press. Their murder trial took place during the scorching hot summer of 1949 in Bronx Criminal Court, where the salacious testimony of abnormal sexual practices caused a near riot among spectators. The Latino Lothario and the plump, lovesick girlfriend who killed lonely, sex-starved women was a story weirder and more intriguing than anything out of the trashiest pulp magazines of the 1940s. She was born Martha Julie Seabrook in 1919 in the town of Milton in northwest Florida. As a small child, Martha developed a glandular condition that caused her to physically mature faster than most children. By the age of 10, she possessed a woman's body and the sexual drive of an adult. Unfortunately, she was already obese by that age and suffered ridicule from not only her classmates, but from her domineering mother as well. It was claimed at Martha's murder trial in 1951 that her brother assaulted her at an early age. When she told her mother about the incident, she blamed Martha and beat her. Wherever she went thereafter, her mother followed her. If a boy showed any interest in Martha, her mother was sure to chase the boy away with a barrage of insults and threats. Throughout her teenage years, Martha was the focus of cruel jokes and insults, which drove her further within herself. She became reclusive, withdrawn, and had virtually no friends her own age. Later, Martha attended a nursing school in Pensacola, where she graduated first in her class in 1942. However, because of her appearance, she was unable to gain employment in the nursing field. She was forced to take a job working for a mortician in a local funeral home, preparing female bodies for burial. It was a surreal environment for Martha, who was already remote and lonely. Tending to the bodies of the dead at all hours of the day and night, she may have found a strange solace in the company of those who couldn't hurt her with criticism and ridicule. She lived with the dead. In 1942, desperate to begin a new life, she moved to California. She soon got a job at an army hospital working as a nurse. But at night, Martha would frequent the city's bars, where she'd pick up soldiers on leave and, at times, have sex with some of them. As a result of one of these encounters, she became pregnant. The father was a soldier who was uninterested in her. When he discovered Martha was pregnant, he attempted to commit suicide by throwing himself into a nearby bay. Unable to convince the father to wed, and deeply ashamed that a man would rather die than marry her, She returned to Florida, depressed and alone. In Milton, Martha soon realized that she had to explain the pregnancy. She made up a story that she met and married a naval officer in California. She bought a wedding ring and wore it proudly around town. Her husband would soon return from the Pacific, and then everyone would meet him. Of course, that day could never happen, so she had to come up with a remedy. She arranged to have a telegram sent to herself announcing that her husband was killed in action. She went into hysterics when she received the news. The town mourned for her, and the story even appeared in the local papers. Martha received a great deal of attention and sympathy for her loss. In the spring of 1944, she gave birth to a daughter, Willa Dean. A few months later, she met a Pensacola bus driver named Alfred Beck, and Martha became pregnant again. Alfred, perhaps feeling guilty about the pregnancy, reluctantly married her in late 1944. 6 months later, they were divorced. Martha had lost her job the year before and now found herself alone once again, this time with 2 small kids and no income. She fell into a fantasy world of romance novels and afternoon movies like Confidential Agent and Gaslight, which featured her favorite leading man of the day, Charles Boyer. She read true confession-type magazines and dreamt of the man who would save her from her loneliness and desperation. In early 1946, she finally secured a job at a Pensacola hospital for children. Martha was actually a very good nurse. She took her job and responsibilities very seriously. "I chose this profession," she wrote, "without thought of self and want to prepare myself for this profession, not for material gains, but for the purpose of aiding humanity and rendering service to others." Unable to be happy in the social side of her life, Martha put everything she had into her work. Before the year was out, she received a promotion and eventually became nurse superintendent of the hospital. But still, she was depressed and yearned for the day when she could have a man all to herself, a man that would give her sexual fulfillment, companionship, and above all, the kind of love she read about for years in the hundreds of magazines that lay strewn all over her apartment. As a result of a practical joke played by a coworker, Martha received an ad in the mail to join a Lonely Hearts Club. When she read the ad, she broke down into bitter tears. "How could I forget that day?" she later said. But in an act of defiance, Martha placed an ad in Mother Deneen's Family Club for Lonely Hearts. She had to fill out a form describing herself and sent it in for publication. But she conveniently left out the fact that she weighed nearly 250 pounds and already had 2 kids. The ad was published, and Martha breathlessly awaited her Prince Charming. Each day when she returned home from work, she anxiously checked the mailbox, searching for the letter that would sweep her away from the pain of loneliness. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born on the island of Hawaii on December 17, 1914. His parents were of Spanish descent and proud people who were disappointed in Raymond's frail and sickly appearance. His father especially was not fond of Raymond and wished for a stronger son. When Raymond was only 3, the family moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut. In 1932, Raymond decided to go to Spain to work and live on an uncle's farm. There, at the age of 20, he married a local woman named Encarnacion Robles and set up house. By then, Raymond had left behind the awkward weakness of his youth and evolved into a handsome, well-built young man. He had a calm, gentle manner and was well-liked in the village of Orgiva. When the Second World War began, Raymond served with Spain's merchant marine, but he soon found service with the British government as a spy and apparently achieved a certain notoriety in the intelligence-gathering community. Little is known of his wartime activities, but the Defense Security Office in Gibraltar once said that he was entirely loyal to the Allied cause and carried out his duties, which were sometimes difficult and dangerous, extremely well. In late 1945, after the war was over, Fernandez decided to return to America to find work and then send for Encarnacion and his newborn son. He managed to get passage on a freighter that was headed for the island of Curaçao in the Dutch West Indies. While on board the ship, Raymond was the victim of a life-altering event. As he attempted to come up to the deck, an open steel hatch cover fell directly on the top of his head. The injury caused a severe indentation on his skull and may have damaged his brain in an irreversible way. When the ship docked in December 1945, he was placed in the hospital where he remained until March 1946. Upon his release from the hospital, Raymond had undergone a personality transformation. Before the accident, he was an ordinary young man who was socially adept, open with people, and courteous in manner. But after the accident, Raymond became distant, moody, and quick to anger. He didn't smile as easily, and when he spoke, he often rambled. Personality disorders that result from head injury are well documented, and research suggests that the level of disorder hinges upon the severity and location of the injury. In Fernandez's case, the injury, which fractured his skull, was located in the frontal lobe region that regulates the learning, reasoning, and logical segments of brain function. There was no doubt Raymond Fernandez was a changed man. He bought passage on another ship headed for Alabama. When the boat arrived at the port of Mobile, Fernandez did a stupid thing. He stole a large quantity of clothing and items from the ship's storeroom that were clearly marked. When he tried to pass through customs, he was immediately arrested. He had no explanation for his conduct, and when he was asked why he committed the theft, he said, "I don't know. I can't think. I can't say why I did it. I just saw other men putting a towel or two in their bags, so I thought I'd do the same. Only I just couldn't seem to stop." He was sentenced to 1 year in the federal penitentiary in Tallahassee, Florida. While he was in prison, Fernandez became cellmates with a Haitian man. This man, a follower of the ancient religion Vodun, introduced Raymond to the practice of voodoo and plunged him into the world of the occult. He became convinced that he had a secret power over women that originated with voodoo. His sexual powers were at their peak, he believed, when they were enhanced by the energy of the Vodun. Erroneously described as an evil religion, it's a derivative of several African religions, mostly Nigerian, some of which go back over 5,000 years. Raymond fell into the dark side of voodoo and believed that he was an Aungun, a priest who could obtain his mystical powers from the Loa, that means spirits. He read the notorious Haiti, or the Black Republic, written in 1884 and the source of a great deal of misinformation about the Vodun religion. It contained lurid descriptions of human sacrifice and tortures, which later captured the imagination of Hollywood filmmakers who produced films that perpetrated that myth. Fernandez told friends that he could make love with women from great distances by placing voodoo powders inside the envelopes. In his letters, he asked his victims to send a lock of their hair, an earring, or some personal item that he could utilize in voodoo rituals to strengthen his supernatural control. Unsuspecting women, he believed, then fell at his feet, consumed by the erotic sexual persuasion of Raymond Fernandez, Voodoo Hongun. In 1946, Raymond was released from prison and moved to Brooklyn to live with his sister. His relatives were upset with his appearance, which had changed dramatically since the accident. He was mostly bald, whereas before he had an abundance of rich, dark hair. The scar from the accident was plainly visible on the top of his head. Raymond locked himself in his room for days at a time and complained of painful headaches. During this period, he began to write dozens of letters to Lonely Hearts Clubs, where, through the mail, he began to seduce gullible females who were looking for men. Once he gained their trust, he'd steal money, jewelry, checks, whatever he could embezzle. Then he'd disappear forever. The victims, often too embarrassed to complain, rarely reported the episodes to the police. For months, Fernandez immersed himself in the world of Lonely Hearts Clubs, writing letters to numerous women, often at the same time. In 1947, he began a correspondence with Jane Lucilla Thompson, who had recently separated from her husband. She was lonely, susceptible to kindness, and ripe for the picking. After a letter-writing courtship, Jane Thompson agreed to meet Fernandez. In October 1947, they bought cruise ship tickets with Jane Thompson's money and took a trip to Spain. For several weeks, they traveled together and booked hotel rooms as man and wife. They dined and took sightseeing trips across the Spanish countryside. Fernandez, though, was still legally married to his first wife, Encarnacion Robles. Eventually, he found his way to La Linea, where Encarnacion lived with his 2 kids. He introduced her to Jane, and for a time, the unlikely three frequently dined out on the town. Things seemed to be going well, but on the night of November 7, 1947, something happened between the 2 women. It's believed that some type of disagreement or fight erupted between Raymond and Jane at the hotel in La Linea. He was seen running out of the room late that night. The next morning, Jane Lucilla Thompson was found dead in her room of unknown causes. Her body was removed and buried without an autopsy. Later, when suspicions of murder by poison were aroused, her body would be exhumed. Meanwhile, Fernandez skipped town, leaving his wife, the long-suffering Encarnacion, alone once more. He caught the next boat to the United States, where he showed up at Jane's old apartment in New York City. With the forged last will and testament of Jane Thompson in his hand, he took possession of the apartment and all the furnishings, despite the fact that Jane's elderly mother lived there. During this tumultuous time, while Raymond traveled through Spain with Jane Thompson, dined with both women, and then confiscated the New York City apartment from the mother of his latest victim, Fernandez continued his correspondence with dozens of women. One of them was Martha Seabrook Beck. In sunny Florida, Martha went about her business at the Pensacola Hospital, where she was so good at her job. She was made supervisor of all the nurses in just 6 months' time. Her professional career was finally on track, but her social life and her yearning for romance was still at a dead end. After she wrote her first letter to Mother Deneen's club, she waited. She waited nearly 2 weeks for a return letter, and each day she was disappointed when none arrived. But sometime before Christmas Day in 1947, she received her first and only reply. The letter was from Raymond Fernandez from West 139th Street in New York City. He said he was a successful and well-respected businessman who made his fortune in the import and export trade. The words were written in an elaborate manner, extremely courteous, and seemed sincere. He wrote that he was a Spaniard who'd recently left his country to come to America for better business opportunities. He now lived alone here in this apartment, much too large for a bachelor, but I hope someday to share it with a wife. Fernandez wrote that he knew Martha was a nurse, and he wrote to her because, "I know you have a full heart with a great capacity for comfort and love." It was too much for the starry-eyed Martha. She carried the letter with her everywhere she went and read it at every opportunity. She couldn't believe how well he wrote and expressed himself. She immediately bought expensive stationery and began a 2-week correspondence that included a dozen letters and an exchange of photographs. The photos were a little bit of a problem. Of course, Martha didn't want to scare off the prospective Romeo with a full frontal view of her generous size. Instead, she sent Fernandez a group photo of all the nurses at the hospital, in which she was partially hidden behind a row of friends. In the accompanying letter, she wrote, "It doesn't do me justice." She couldn't have known that size or appearance was of little concern to Raymond Fernandez. By this time, he'd already defrauded, tricked, deceived, and stolen from dozens of women across the country. He didn't care if his victims were fat, skinny, old, or young. He had only one criterion: they had to have assets. When he learned that Martha was a nurse, he assumed that she had money or a house or something of value. He knew that he'd have to develop a relationship by mail and maybe a telephone call or two before arranging a face-to-face meeting. He had to build trust and inspire a level of sexual anticipation in his victims. Through repeated acts of trial and error, he built up a standard routine, and he followed that script almost in every instance right up to the end. When the victim realized that she'd been taken, most times she was reluctant to call the police. There were strong feelings of humiliation, guilt, and even complicity in the crime. And, above all, the women did not want their names dragged into public view as lonely hearts seeking men through newspaper ads. The self-absorbed Fernandez just assumed that most women were satisfied with his sexual dexterity and imagined they simply accepted the theft as a valid price to pay for a few days or weeks of happiness with a wonderful lover like him. After a few letters back and forth, Fernandez performed the necessary step of asking Martha for a lock of her hair. With this hair, Fernandez was able to perform his voodoo ritual, which he believed would make Martha unable to resist his sexual charms. He followed directions from a book written by William Seabrook called Magic Island, a Bible of voodoo and secret spells. He considered it a good omen that his favorite author and his latest victim shared the same name. Martha was thrilled that a man would ask for a lock of her hair. That had never happened before. She happily sent a generous piece of her hair with the very next letter and doused it with a smattering of perfume. Maybe her turn had finally come, she may have thought. Maybe she imagined that Raymond Fernandez would be her knight in shining armor, her dream lover to take her away from the daily routine of bedpans and a life of drudgery. Maybe her luck had finally changed. After Fernandez built up enough anticipation in Martha and he performed the necessary voodoo ritual, he decided that the time had come for the meeting. He arranged to take a train down to Florida and for Martha to meet him at the station. Of course, Martha, realizing that she was about to confront the lies she'd told about herself, was extremely nervous. But her curiosity and desire quickly overcame whatever fears she may have had. On December 28, 1947, he arrived in Pensacola, Florida. At first, Fernandez must have been surprised at her size, but outwardly, he gave no signs of his disapproval. When she first saw Fernandez, Martha was thrilled. She couldn't believe how lucky she was to have such a handsome man. He was everything she dreamed of, and more. She thought he strongly resembled her hero, Charles Boyer. They returned to her home where Martha introduced Raymond to her 2 children and prepared dinner. Once the children were put to bed, Raymond made his move. Martha, already thrilled that he'd pay any attention to her whatsoever, quickly surrendered. For the first time in her life, she attained sexual fulfillment. It was a revelation. Fernandez, though, was still thinking of his scheme to fleece the gullible Martha. He was anxious to learn of her assets in order to determine if she was worth the effort. They spent the next day and night together and had sex several times. Martha swore her undying love and wanted him to stay in Florida to marry her. But Fernandez did not want marriage. He wanted to continue his work. He suddenly told Martha that he had business in New York and really should return as soon as possible. Martha protested, but Fernandez calmed her by saying he'd soon be back or send money so she could join him in New York. Martha interpreted that as a sort of proposal. After he boarded the train in Jacksonville, she went back to Milton and told everyone that she was about to be married again. A shower was prepared in her honor. She was happy like she'd never been before. Then, on the day of the shower, she received a letter from Fernandez in which he said she'd misunderstood his feelings for her and he'd not be returning to Florida. She was devastated. After Martha attempted suicide, Fernandez relented and agreed to let her visit him in New York. She stayed for a glorious 2 weeks. But when she returned to her job in Florida, she was fired without explanation. When she tried to find out why, her employer refused to elaborate. Martha felt it was because the town had learned about her scandalous affair with a Latin lover from New York. She picked up her last paycheck as Martha Fernandez and went home to pack. She got her 2 kids dressed, said goodbye to a few friends, and got on the first bus to New York. When Fernandez answered his door in the morning of January 18, 1948, much to his dismay, he found Martha and her 2 children standing there. This was a major stumbling block in his career of theft and deception. Fernandez, though, didn't disapprove of having Martha around. There was something comforting about her, the way she catered to his every need, made his bed, and cooked for him. But the kids had to go, he insisted. Martha reluctantly decided that giving up her children was the price she had to pay for Raymond. On January 25, 1948, she dropped off her kids at the Salvation Army and abandoned them. For the next 3 years, she had no contact with them whatsoever. Not until she was in Sing Sing prison in 1951 did she ever give them another thought. Once they were rid of all the children, Beck and Fernandez had the apartment all to themselves. It was at this point that Raymond brought out all of his lonely heart's letters. He told her everything, the dozens of women he deceived and robbed, his wife in Spain, and the other wives as well. Martha, already committed to Fernandez, realized that there was no turning back. He was her man, and she was his woman. The way Martha saw the situation, it was her duty to help him. Together, they made plans for his next victim. As they pored over the photographs of widows and lonely hearts, they settled upon a Miss Esther Henn in southern Pennsylvania. The unlikely pair traveled down to Pennsylvania where they met with Ms. Henn. Martha posed as Raymond's sister-in-law. Within the week, on February 28, 1948, Esther Henn and Raymond Fernandez were married in a brief ceremony at the county clerk's office in Fairfax, Virginia. Then the newlyweds, with Martha, returned to the apartment on West 139th Street. She later told reporters, "For 4 days, he was very polite to me. Then he gave me tongue lashings when I wouldn't sign over my insurance policies and my teacher's pension fund to him. Things went downhill after that. I began to hear stories about how he went to Spain with a woman and she died," she said. Shortly afterward, the new Mrs. Fernandez left the apartment minus her car and hundreds of dollars that Raymond stole from her. Several other women followed Esther Hen in quick succession, including 2 named Myrtle. One of them, Myrtle Young of Green Forest, Arkansas, agreed to marry Fernandez. On August 14, 1948, he and Myrtle were married in Cook County, Illinois. Martha posed as Raymond's sister this time and did everything she could to make sure that the marriage was never consummated. It included sleeping in the same bed as Myrtle. This went on for several days until Myrtle protested so much that Raymond gave her a heavy dose of drugs, which caused her to lapse into unconsciousness. With Martha's help, Raymond carried Myrtle onto a bus and sent her back to Little Rock, Arkansas, where she had to be carried off the bus by the police. She was also robbed of $4,000. The very next day, Myrtle Young died in a Little Rock hospital. Meanwhile, Martha and Raymond continued on their way back east. They stopped in several towns and met with an assortment of women who had been corresponding with Raymond. They managed to steal some money, but none looked promising as a long-term investment. They arrived back in New York and soon were scouring the Lonely Hearts ads for more victims. They found one in New England, but when they went to meet her, she was younger than Martha imagined, and she wouldn't let Raymond work the scam. The money was dwindling lower and lower. The winter was coming, and neither Martha nor Raymond had real jobs. They were desperate for more victims. Soon they located Janet Fay, a 66-year-old widow who lived in Albany, New York. Raymond took pen in hand and began the game once again. Janet Fay rented a spacious apartment in the downtown part of the city, and more importantly, had money in the bank. She had a habit of writing letters to Lonely Hearts Clubs, and despite warnings from her friends and family, she continued the practice. Mrs. Fay was a religious woman who attended Catholic church every Sunday, a fact that was exploited by Fernandez, who then laced his future letters with references to God and religion. Fernandez often used the name Charles Martin for his correspondence with his victims. After a period of several weeks in which Fernandez persuaded Janet that his aims were honorable, arrangements were made for him to come to Albany just before New Year's Day. On December 30th, 1948, Martha and Raymond arrived in downtown Albany and checked into a hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez. The next day, he showed up at Janet's door carrying a bouquet of flowers. They spent the day together getting acquainted and discussing religious matters. Over the next few days, Fernandez brought along Martha, introducing her as his sister, and together they had dinner and toured the city. Janet even allowed them to sleep over in her apartment. Soon, Raymond proposed marriage to Janet, and she readily accepted. They made plans to move to Long Island, where Martha had already rented an apartment at 15 Adeline Street, Valley Stream, Long Island. During the first week in January 1949, Janet made the rounds of the Albany banks, clearing out her bank accounts. She accumulated over $6,000 in cash and checks. As soon as she completed her errands, Fernandez convinced her to leave Albany. On January 4, 1949, Fernandez, Beck, and Janet Fay left Albany and drove to Long Island. When they arrived at the apartment, they ate dinner together and settled in for the night. Fernandez fell asleep first, leaving Janet and Martha together alone. What exactly transpired between them will never be known, for Martha told several different stories later when questioned by the police. But she did say, "I was just burning up with jealousy and anger." Martha also said that when she entered Raymond's bedroom, she saw Janet naked with her arm around Raymond. Already upset with Raymond because he showed too much attention to Janet, the sight of the two of them in bed was too much for Martha to bear. According to Martha, Janet became angry and yelled, "I won't allow you to live with us. You're the most brazen bitch I've ever seen." An argument followed, during which Fernandez allegedly told Martha, "Keep this woman quiet. I don't care what you do. Just keep her quiet." Martha later testified she blacked out and couldn't remember what happened. "The next I knew, the defendant Fernandez had me by the shoulders and was shaking me," she said. Janet Fay's body lay at Martha's feet, bleeding profusely from a severe head wound. She was bludgeoned into unconsciousness with a ball-peen hammer and then garroted using a scarf as a tourniquet around her neck. Martha said that immediately after the killing, she was in some type of a trance. Fernandez and Beck cleaned up the room, wrapped the body in towels and sheets, and pushed it into a closet. Then they went to sleep. The next day, they bought a large trunk and dumped the body inside. They drove over to Raymond's sister's house, where they convinced her to store the trunk in her basement for the time being. 11 days later, on January 15th, Raymond retrieved the trunk from his sister's home and buried it in the cellar of a rented house. Raymond then covered up the grave with cement. For the next week, they cashed Janet Faye's checks and typed letters to her family saying, "I'm all excited and having the time of my life. I never felt as happy before. I will soon be Mrs. Martin and will go to Florida." They signed the letters Janet L. Faye. But in their haste, they made a pivotal error. Janet did not own a typewriter and couldn't type. Her family immediately notified the police. Beck and Fernandez quickly left Valley Stream and headed west to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where their next victim was waiting. For several weeks, Fernandez corresponded with a young widow named Delphine Downing, 41, who also had a 2-year-old child, Raynell. Delphine also knew Fernandez as Charles Martin, a successful businessman in the export trade who also had a special love for children. So when Charles wrote Delphine and told her that he was coming for a visit to Byron Center, a suburb of Grand Rapids, she was pleasantly surprised. She also didn't mind when he said that he'd be bringing his sister Martha along. When they met in late January 1949, Delphine was impressed with Charles and may have thought that she had a future with him. She liked his courteous manner and considerate attitude towards Raynell. Before the month was out, he was having sex with Delphine, a development that had Martha quietly seething with rage. But Delphine's happiness was short-lived. One morning, she entered the bathroom and accidentally observed Charles without his toupee. She was shocked at his baldness and the ugly scar on the top of his head. She accused Fernandez of fraud and deception. Fernandez turned on the charm to placate her, but nothing worked. Martha was still burning inside, but remained quiet, hoping the situation would calm down. She convinced Delphine to take some sleeping pills. While the pills did their work, Raynell began to cry, perhaps sensing that her mother was not acting normally. Martha, already furious with Delphine and Fernandez, suddenly grabbed the child and began to choke her into unconsciousness, causing obvious bruises on her neck. Fernandez was angry. "If she wakes up and sees Raynell, she'll go to the police," he said. "Do something, Ray," Martha said. Fernandez went into the next room and retrieved a handgun that belonged to Delphine's dead husband. He wrapped the pistol in a blanket and placed the muzzle against Delphine's head. He pulled the trigger, sending a bullet into her brain, which killed her instantly. Raynell watched the entire event from a few feet away. Then they wrapped Delphine up in sheets and carried her into the basement. They dug a large hole and dumped the body in. Fernandez covered the grave with cement while Martha dutifully cleaned up the murder scene. For the next 2 days, they made their plans to escape. They cashed in whatever checks that Delphine had and looted the house of all valuables. Meanwhile, Raynell cried constantly and refused to eat. They talked over what should be done with the little girl, but couldn't agree. Ultimately, Fernandez told Martha to get rid of her. "I can't do it, Ray, I can't," she pleaded. But Martha was already in too deep. She was an accomplice to several murders and partner to dozens of frauds and thefts. She had no real home and had abandoned her own children to be with her Svengali lover. And now, after burying yet another body to hide their crimes, Fernandez wanted her to do the unthinkable. She may have tried to resist, but his power over her was complete. As Raynell continued to sob, Beck and Fernandez transferred some of the water that had accumulated in the basement and filled an empty metal tub to the brim. Then, in an act of callous depravity, Martha picked up the child and held her under the water until she drowned. A few minutes later, Fernandez was digging another grave next to Delphine. Only this one was a lot smaller. Although they were now free to leave town and move on, they chose not to. Instead, Martha and Raymond went to the movies. Later, when they came back to the apartment, they began to pack their bags. There was a knock at the door, and when Fernandez opened it, he found two stern-looking cops standing in front of him. Suspicious neighbors had called the police. After they were arrested on February 28, 1949, Beck and Fernandez were brought to the Kent County DA's office, where they were questioned by the police and the district attorney. Perhaps because they were already resigned to their fate, neither asked for an attorney, nor did they attempt to avoid questioning. "I'm no average killer," Fernandez said to the investigators. Together, they told their salacious story of sex, deception, and murder to the police. They signed a 73-page confession in the presence of Kent County DA Roger O. McMahon, who assured them that they'd never be turned over to the New York police. Fernandez and Beck were aware that there was no death penalty in Michigan and were content to remain in Kent County rather than be extradited back to New York to face charges for the Fay killing. "The electric chair scares me," Martha said. With a promise that if they told the truth, Fernandez could be out of prison in 6 years with time off for good behavior, they cooperated fully with investigators. The next day, the Lonely Hearts murder case was in the nation's headlines. It was page 1 in every big city newspaper. The New York Times wrote, "3 Lonely Hearts murders, trap pair, body dug up here." Wherever Beck and Fernandez went while in custody, the photographers followed, hoping to catch a photo of America's most dysfunctional couple. And just as soon, the process of dehumanizing Martha Beck began. The papers called her fat, simpering, Big Martha, a 200-pound figure of wrath, the giggling divorcee, unattractive, a weird woman, and other humiliating terms. Each newspaper story published during that period included her weight, which was falsely reported in nearly every instance. Her actual weight at the time of her arrest was 233 pounds. Unfortunately, the New York press has a long and shameful history of such reporting, particularly in murder cases where the accused is a female. From the time of Ruth Snyder in 1927, a woman convicted of murdering her husband, right up until the modern era, the city's tabloids often lose every sense of objectivity when it comes to reporting on criminal trials in which the defendant is a woman. Snyder, especially, was vilified by the press in a way that's seldom seen for any criminal defendant, male or female. Her case became the journalism benchmark on how a woman can be totally demonized by newspaper reporting. Headlines such as, "Reveal Lonely Heart's blood money dealings," "Heart's killer explodes at attorney," and "Fernandez tells strange love story," built an image in the public's eye that the two defendants were already guilty and a trial was just a necessary formality. In a startling display of the media's bias in this case, even just a cursory read of the press coverage before and during the murder trial reveals an expectation, even a demand, that Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez receive the death penalty. The pressure for them to die was building. During the week of March 8, 1949, after several phone calls from New York Governor Thomas Dewey to the state of Michigan, a deal was cut with Kent County prosecutors. They would waive criminal charges for the Downing murders and permit New York to extradite the defendants to face charges in the Janet Fay murder. The reason was simple. Michigan had no electric chair. Amidst a stunning, deadly heat wave that gripped the nation that summer, the trial of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez opened on June 28, 1949. A young Manhattan attorney, Herbert E. Rosenberg, was chosen to represent Martha and Raymond. Of course, one attorney to represent both defendants was a violation of ethics and unfair to the accused, but the decision was allowed to stand. A change of venue from Nassau County, Long Island, where the Fay murder was committed, was granted, and the trial moved to the more spacious, more accessible Bronx Supreme Court near baseball's famous Yankee Stadium. But nothing could save the spectators from the oppressive heat. Over the July 4th weekend in 1949, at least 881 people died nationwide from heat and accidents, a record that still stands today. Judge Ferdinand Pecora sat on the bench, a stern but fair jurist who had a reputation for moving things along in his trials. The prosecutor was Nassau County District Attorney Edward Robinson, Jr., who was on the case since the very beginning and had participated in the deal to extradite the defendants back from Michigan. The prosecution began its case with a barrage of witnesses, including the medical examiner, friends of Janet Fay from Albany, and the landlord from Janet's apartment. Michigan investigators followed them to the stand, and forensic detectives later explained the substantial physical evidence to the court. Raymond Fernandez took the stand on July 11, 1949. He denied any role in the Fay killing and said that he only met Martha a short time before by writing to Lonely Hearts Clubs. He admitted confessing to the Michigan authorities, but wished to retract the entire statement because he had confessed only to save his sweetheart, Martha. In a soft voice, and often smiling over at Martha as she nodded approvingly during his testimony, Fernandez appeared the picture of the sophisticated Spanish gentleman. "All my statements were made for the purpose of helping Martha," he said softly, exposing his gold-lined front teeth. "I love her. It couldn't be anything else," he added. But prosecutor Edward Robinson jumped all over Fernandez's story by bringing up Jane Thompson, Delphine Downing, Raynell Downing, and Myrtle Young, all dead after meeting with Raymond Fernandez. Robinson kept after him in a shouting, blistering examination. "Mr. Fernandez is not deaf," said Martha from her seat after one exchange. But Fernandez scored points also, especially when he described the Michigan interrogation. "Everybody was permitted to question me, including the newspapermen," he said. "I didn't know if I was coming or going, and the DA said that whatever I said would not be used against me." Fernandez regained his composure and continued on, sensing that this point was one to dwell on. "They'd look upon me as a murderer in New York and let her go," he said. "As a man, I could take it better than a woman. If I cooperated, they said, I would do 6 years and be paroled. Then I could do what I liked. If I didn't cooperate, I would go to jail for life." But the defendants had too much against them. The lengthy confession with all its gruesome detail came back to haunt them many times over. As the statement was read into the record, the courtroom gasped when they heard descriptions of the murders. "I can still hear it. The blood was dripping, 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 and the sound of it just sounded like it could be heard all over the house," Martha had told the Michigan investigators. While Fernandez was strangling Mrs. Fay, she said, her false teeth fell out. "They had the presence of mind to dispose of them because we realized in case her body was found, if the teeth were there, that would be a mode of identification." DA Robinson then asked Fernandez if he shot and killed Delphine Downing. "That is true," he said simply, but when asked if he killed Janet Fay, he denied it. At that point, Martha suddenly jumped out of her seat. "I think at this time, Your Honor, I want to take the stand," she shouted. Judge Pecora admonished her as her attorney pushed her down into the seat. Page after page of their confession, each one more damning than the last, went on to describe their twisting journey through deception, sex, fraud, and murder. The testimony of Raymond Fernandez included descriptions of extensive sexual relations he had with his various victims. Much was made of a 3-way strip poker game he played with Martha and Esther Henn, one of his victims. The last hand was played for who would have the pleasure of sleeping with Fernandez. Martha won. This type of testimony continued through the morning of July 21st and was so lurid that unauthorized persons were not permitted to loiter outside the courtroom. The New York Times said that many of the would-be spectators, predominantly women, did without lunch in order not to lose their places. The anticipation had been building for weeks. The tabloids were filled with stories of how Martha would testify. Would she give up Raymond? Would she take the blame for all the murders herself? Would she cry? When her name was called on the morning of July 25, 1949, she rose from the defense table and walked slowly to the witness stand. She climbed the 2 steps up to the platform and sat gently into her seat. She wore a gray and white polka dot summer dress, 2 strands of pearls around her neck, and green wedge-type shoes. It was an outfit inappropriate for a courtroom. After Raymond described their abnormal sexual practices during his testimony, the New York papers went into overdrive to further degrade the accused killers. The courtroom was jammed with an overflow of spectators and reporters. When Martha told her story to a hushed and crowded room, Fernandez sat rigid in his chair, not knowing what to expect. Martha began with her childhood, reciting all the problems she suffered through as a child. When she was just 13, Martha said, she was subjected to 2 incestuous attacks, which left her frightened and shy, and also pregnant. She said that the assaults preyed on my mind ever since. She dreamed constantly of being in love. Life was not worth living, she explained. I'd rather be dead than continue arguing with my mother each day of my life. She said that her mother was overbearing to such a degree that I had to give her a day-to-day story of who I was with and what I did. She attempted suicide on several occasions. Her luck with men was just as bad. Every time she developed a romantic relationship, she said, it went nowhere. Her first marriage ended when her husband walked out, leaving her pregnant. He gave me the impression that I was the only one he'd ever loved, she said tearfully. Each boyfriend after her marriage was a disaster. She had 2 children along the way, and yet still could not hold on to a man. She said the remorse, fear, and shame drove her to attempt suicide once again. She told the court that she tried to commit suicide 6 times in the year before she was arrested, and that it entered my mind almost every day. When she explained how she dropped off her children on January 25, 1948 at the Salvation Army in New York City, she broke down again. After a short recess, Martha returned and resumed her testimony. She claimed that she knew Fernandez was a murderer and that she helped him find lonely women to victimize. Raymond got quite a kick out of the photographs of some of the old hags who wrote to him and expected him to correspond with them, she said. At times, Martha giggled when she recalled how easily Raymond was able to deceive his victims. When the questioning turned to Mrs. Fay, Martha said the last thing she remembered was Fernandez ordering her to keep Mrs. Fay quiet. Then she found herself standing over Mrs. Fay while Fernandez shook her shoulders, screaming, "My God, Martha, what have you done?" When the prosecutor asked about her love of Fernandez, Martha defended him. "We loved each other, and I consider it absolutely sacred. You refer to the lovemaking as abnormal, but for the love I had for Fernandez, nothing is abnormal," she said. Martha fidgeted in the stand, her large frame looking out of place in a wooden chair designed for smaller people. She said, "A request from Mr. Fernandez to me is a command. I loved him enough to do anything he asked me to." She insisted she remembered nothing about the killing until she saw Mrs. Fay at her feet, bleeding profusely all over the rug. At her instruction, Fernandez wrapped a scarf around Mrs. Fay's neck and twisted it like a tourniquet. With a straight face, Martha said her training as a nurse taught her that a tourniquet around the neck would stop bleeding from the head. For 3 days, she was questioned relentlessly by Nassau County District Attorney Edward Robinson, Jr. At times, tearful, angry, and rebellious, Martha gave details of her sexual relationship with Fernandez that made some women leave the courtroom. When she began to describe certain sex acts connected with the practice of voodoo, a contingent of 24 cops had to be called to the Bronx Supreme Court building to contend with the crowds that tried to push their way into the courtroom. The New York Times reported, "The Lonely Hearts murder trial was disrupted yesterday afternoon by a near riot of would-be spectators outside the courtroom." On August 18, 1949, after 44 days of testimony and a 5-hour charge by Judge Pecora, the case went to the jury. They took a break for dinner and began deliberations at 9:45 p.m. Later that night, they came back and asked for a reading of Fernandez's confession. They also asked for a clarification on the term premeditation. Some observers thought that Fernandez would take the weight of the case while Martha would be convicted on a lesser charge. But the jurors worked through the night with no sleep, and by 8:30 a.m. the next morning, it was over. Ironically, when the verdict was announced, there was almost no one in the courtroom. Thinking that the jury would continue deliberations in the morning, all the spectators went home for the night. Almost immediately after the jury received the case on the night before, a vote was taken. The tally was already 11-1 for conviction. A single juror wondered if Martha was sane and if Fernandez had premeditated the murder of Mrs. Fay. After several hours of debate, that juror gave in and voted for conviction. The jury of 10 men and 2 women found Fernandez and Beck guilty of first-degree murder. The defendants displayed no emotion or surprise, though the Daily News said, "Mrs. Beck, as she did so many times during the trial, took on a brazen pose." There was no recommendation for mercy for either defendant, and sentencing was set for the following Monday. On August 22nd, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez stood impassively as Judge Pecora sentenced them both to die in the electric chair on October 10th of that year. Within the hour, they were on their way to Sing Sing Prison on the banks of the Hudson River. Martha became inmate number 108594, and Fernandez became 108595. Upon admission, Martha was asked routine questions. "To what do you attribute your criminal act?" the guard asked. "Something I got into. I had no control," she replied. To the same question, Fernandez said, "An accident." They were processed, immediately separated, and placed on death row. Ironically, Martha was assigned the same cell as murderess Ruth Snyder in 1927 and later occupied by the irrepressible Eva Koo in 1936. Both were executed. The cell consisted of a bunk, a sink, and a toilet. Her only companions would be the matrons on duty. Martha submitted a list of approved visitors that included her divorced husband, Alfred Beck, her brother, and 3 sisters. She also included her son, Anthony, now 4, and her daughter, Carmen, 5, who she hadn't seen since January 1948 when she abandoned them at the Salvation Army office in Manhattan. Martha and Raymond's stay on death row in Sing Sing prison had to be one of the most tumultuous events in that prison's history. From the day they arrived on August 19, 1949, until March 8, 1951, when they were executed, the ongoing soap opera of the broken-hearted Martha never ceased. Fed by intermittent press stories of Martha's sexual deprivation and erratic behavior, the public never lost its appetite for gossip about the Lonely Hearts killers. In September 1950, it was rumored that Martha was having an ongoing sexual relationship with one of the guards, a story that made front-page news in the tabloids. "For several weeks I've suffered in silence because of the rumors started by Mr. Fernandez," she wrote in a letter to Warden Deno of Sing Sing. "To print that or say that I'm having an affair with a guard is one of the most asinine and ridiculous statements ever made," she said. "Approximately 25 million persons heard Winchell's broadcast tonight, including members of my own family, and I'll admit it will be a shock and embarrassment to them." But Fernandez apparently believed the story and submitted court papers to have his case dropped. The petition stated, "The triangle subjects him to mental torture beyond endurance," and requested that all appeals on his behalf be stopped immediately so that he can be executed forthwith to end his living death. Martha asked her attorney, Herbert Rosenberg, to do something to stop the rumors. "What do they expect me to do?" she wrote. "Sit here and let him destroy the one thread of decency I've left? He's done so much talking about how he has me wrapped around his little finger that it was a blow to his ego when I unwrapped myself and forgot about him. All I can say is, what a character." As time went on, Martha and Raymond continued on a love-hate relationship that changed almost daily. Some days they professed their undying love for one another. Other days they'd barely speak to one another. In one letter, Martha belittled him to her mother. "Oh yes, he's brave when it comes to talking, and hurting others he can kill without batting an eyelash. But to hurt himself, he'd never do it. Not a sniveling, low-down, double-crossing, lying rat like him." Incredibly, all during the time he spent on death row and apparently unknown to Martha, Fernandez continued to write and profess his love for his first wife, Encarnacion, who was still living in La Linea, Spain, with his 4 children. "Kisses and hugs to the children, and you receive 1,000,000 kisses and hugs from the one who always will have you until the last second of my life," Fernandez wrote on January 8, 1951. Encarnacion, who knew that he was involved with many other women, still considered him her husband and wrote, "Do you prefer me to fly to you and spank you for not writing, just as if you were a little child? Kisses from the children. All my love to you, from your wife, Encarna." But it was Martha, the hopeless romantic who was trapped in a web of deceit and obsessive love, who captured the imagination of legions of women. They could empathize with a young girl who was ridiculed and rejected by family, friends, and boyfriends because of a weight problem. They could feel for a woman who wound up on death row because she wanted to please the only man she ever loved and who loved her. Although executions were still a reality at Sing Sing, the number of executions had diminished greatly in the previous few years. There were only 3 in 1950, down from 14 in 1949, and a high of 21 executions in 1936. After several failed appeals, their execution date was set for March 8, 1951. Martha would be the 6th female executed in the state of New York during the 20th century. As time ran out for the Lonely Hearts killers, they reconciled and wrote letters to each other, declaring their love once more. Preparations for the event required weeks of activity by the prison staff. Witnesses for the Beck and Fernandez executions totaled at least 52 people, an unusually high number. They included 9 judges, numerous police officials from Michigan, New York, and Long Island, press representatives from the Detroit News, the New York Journal-American, the World Telegram, the New York Daily News, the New York Mirror, New York's El Diario, the Pensacola Daily Times, and many others. Prison officials were unusually accommodating to the media. On March 8th, her last morning, Martha ate a good breakfast, ham, eggs, and coffee, and took a shower, according to a death row log kept by Matron Evans. Martha ate fair dinner. Laundry sent out, returned, and checked, she wrote. Martha preferred to spend her last day with Matron Evans, but became angry when she discovered that another matron would be on duty from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Martha wrote her last angry letter that afternoon in which she said, "I do not appreciate it one bit, but I'm glad that no member of my family will know how hurt and misled my last day was. It hurts me deeply to realize that I've been wrong in thinking that there could be good in a state-paid employee. Martha Julie, number 108594." According to Martha's written instructions, her last meal consisted of fried chicken, no wings, French fries, lettuce, and tomato salad. Fernandez ordered an onion omelet, French fries, chocolate, and a Cuban cigar. He was especially nervous and confided to prison guards that he may not hold up under the pressure. As the hour grew near, Martha sent Fernandez a note professing her undying love. "The news brought to me that Martha loves me is the best I've had in years. Now I'm ready to die," he said. "So tonight, I'll die like a man." At 11 p.m., the procedure began. First, 2 other convicts, John King, 22, and Richard Power, 22, from Queens, New York, were taken from their cells and marched over to the pale green death chamber. They were executed for the senseless murder of an airline clerk in 1950. After their deaths, Fernandez was removed from his cell and taken to the same cold, barren room. It was tradition at Sing Sing that the weakest should go first. "I want to shout it out. I love Martha. What do the public know about love?" he said. Fernandez was a broken man, panic-stricken and paralyzed with fear. He had to be carried into the chair. Minutes later, Martha was brought into the dreaded room of her own volition, escorted by the matrons. She sat down in the creaking chair carefully and had to wriggle her large frame into the seat. She was able to squeeze into position with difficulty as the teary matrons applied the straps to her body. Her mouth formed the words, "So long," but no sound escaped her lips. At 11:24 p.m., she was dead. It was the first quadruple execution since 1947. The executioner, Joseph Frankel of Cairo, New York, was paid $150 per person for his expertise. Before she was led from her cell, Martha had this final statement for the press. "What does it matter who's to blame?" she said. "My story is a love story, but only those tortured with love can understand what I mean. I was pictured as a fat, unfeeling woman. I'm not unfeeling, stupid, or moronic. In the history of the world, how many crimes have been attributed to love?" The executioner, Joseph Frankel of Cairo, New York, made $600 for the day's work.
In 1958, 19-year-old Charles Starkweather was desperate. Desperate to marry his jailbait girlfriend, desperate to make some money for himself so he wouldn't be broke every day of his life, desperate to get out of the Nebraska town where everyone had figured him for a loser. He and Carol Fugate embarked on a murder spree that horrified the country. This was the country that had elected Eisenhower and Nixon for a second term in 1956, and where the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover was firmly entrenched as the national policeman. This was also a country that was undergoing unsettling cultural changes. Frightening and offensive symbols of rebellion emerged and thrived. Elvis Presley, James Dean, and the whole rock and roll culture focused on a new generation that challenged the status quo of the sterile 1950s. The country that uncomfortably watched James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause in 1956 suddenly saw a Dean-like figure in Charles Starkweather to make them really uncomfortable. What was the world coming to? Were the violence and the alienation of Starkweather just the beginning of some uncontrollable trend that would destroy the fabric of society? Perhaps, but it would take longer than anyone expected. The cinematic embodiments of the Starkweather murder spree took a long time to hit the market and did not take hold as a genre for over 35 years. By then, Starkweather and Fugate are merely smudged antecedents, unrecognizable as direct characters, present only in their angst and isolation. This frightening rebel twosome inspired a whole series of mainstream and not-so-mainstream movies like the 1974 Badlands of Terrence Malick, Wild at Heart by David Lynch, Quentin Tarantino and Tony Scott's 1993 True Romance, Dominic Sena's 1993 California, and Oliver Stone's 1994 Natural Born Killers. Charlie Starkweather was born into a poor, uneducated but hard-working family in Lincoln, Nebraska, on November 24, 1938. He was the third of 7 children that Guy and Helen Starkweather would have. Despite the Depression years in which he and his siblings were born, they never went without food or shelter. They were poor, but it did not stop Charlie from having a decent childhood and good memories of the things his family did together. Their community considered the Starkweather children well-behaved. William Allen in Starkweather describes Guy as a handsome and talkative man who was better suited for white-collar work than the carpenter's trade that he had chosen. He didn't have the necessary physical stamina, and because of various ailments, including a weak back and arthritis, did not work regularly. Helen, a small woman with frizzy red hair, was strong and kind, the one who held things together. She worked as a waitress to augment the limited family income. While Charlie's early childhood memories are very pleasant, his school experiences were traumatic for him. The comfort he felt in his family's surroundings vanished in the classroom. The children laughed at his minor speech impediment and teased him about his bowed legs. Even though Charlie was of average intelligence, he never applied himself and was considered a slow learner. One sure contributor to his problems, which went undetected until he was 15, was his severe myopia. He couldn't even read the largest letter on the eye chart. One of the only subjects in which he excelled was the gym. He was well coordinated and strong. His gymnastic abilities were the only legitimate source of self-esteem that he had. The flip side of the coin was that he used those same physical abilities to fight on a continuous basis with the other boys in the school. He blamed all of his fights on being made fun of as a child. Sometimes his battles were brief outbursts of violence, but other times they were frenzied and prolonged, not ending until they were broken up or his opponent lay senseless. He earned a reputation for being one of the meanest, toughest kids in Lincoln. In the 9th grade, he met Bob Von Bush, who, after Charlie fought with him, became one of his closest friends. Bob said of him, "He could be the kindest person you've ever seen. He'd do anything for you if he liked you. He was a hell of a lot of fun to be around, too. Everything was just one big joke to him, but he had this other side. He could be mean as hell, cruel. If he saw some poor guy on the street who was bigger than he was, better looking or better dressed, he'd try to take the poor bastard down to his size." Both of the boys were James Dean fanatics. They saw all of his movies. There was no question that Charlie tried to imitate Dean's mannerisms, clothes and hairstyle, tight jeans and cowboy boots. But Charlie was no James Dean in looks, brains or talent. He was a very flawed imitation. What was genuine in Charlie, however, was the isolation and rebellion that Dean perfected in his talented characterizations. Jack Sargent in Born Bad sees Starkweather in his autobiography, which Starkweather aptly titled Rebellion, revealed as acutely sensitive, not just to the taunts of his fellow students, but also to his family's low social position and poverty. For Starkweather, poverty was a trap. He could map its confines and trace its borders, but Charles could see no escape for himself. He believed that his very life was rigidly controlled. He saw that he would not be able to flee the bludgeoning poverty that had characterized his working-class childhood, but instead would be condemned to repeat it, eventually finding himself in a manual job, a wife, having children, and then simply dying. Charlie's close buddy Bob von Busch began to date Barbara Fugate in 1956. Charlie eventually became interested in Barbara's younger sister Carol, who had just turned 13. The four of them double-dated on a steady basis, despite Carol's youth. Carol was a pretty girl with dark brown hair and a ready smile. She too had a wide streak of rebellion in her and a mercurial temper. She was not much of a scholar and had failed a grade in elementary school. Even though her teachers considered her a slow learner, Charlie thought she was a wizard. He treated her like a goddess, and probably because she was so young, she thought he was really cool and had no appreciation for his serious weaknesses. William Allen states, "She was impressed by his cars, his toughness, his looks, and despite his poverty, the way he could give her almost anything she wanted." Charlie said that Carol meant more to him than anything had before. Without her, he would be thrust back into the world he hated so much. Carol almost even made him stop hating himself. He saw himself as reflected in her eyes, and he looked good. Charlie quit school at the age of 16 and went to work loading and unloading trucks at the Western Newspaper Union warehouse. His boss didn't think much of Charlie. Sometimes you'd have to tell him something 2 or 3 times. Of all the employees in the warehouse, he was the dumbest man we had. The warehouse was near the school Carol attended, so he could see her every day. He taught her how to drive even though she was too young to drive legally. One day, Carol took Charlie's hot rod and got into a minor accident. Charlie's father was part owner of the car and had to pay for the damages to the other vehicle, an event that caused a huge argument between the two men. The argument became physical, and Charlie was told to find somewhere else to live. Charlie moved into the rooming house where his friends Bob and Barbara Fugate, then Bob's wife, lived. Now that the relationship with his parents was very strained, Carol became the center of Charlie's life. He began telling people that he and Carol were getting married. Then he started telling his friends that Carol was pregnant with his child, a lie that backfired when Carol's parents heard it. Charlie quit his job at the paper company and started to work as a garbage man. It was hardly a career enhancement, but he did it so that he could be off work when she was through with school. The pay was only $42 a week, not enough to support himself, let alone Carol. His landlady was unsympathetic and locked him out until he came up with the rent he owed her. Charlie began to see himself as trapped in a life of poverty. With his limited intellect, the only way out that he could envision was to do something really dramatic like robbing a bank. Every day on his route, collecting the garbage from across town, where the middle and upper classes of Lincoln, Nebraska lived, he saw what he was being excluded from. While heaving heavy, stinking sacks of trash for a minimum wage, Starkweather came to the realization that for him there was one great leveler of class, one way in which he would find himself equal with the rest of society which had oppressed, dominated, and alienated him, a method by which he would find retribution. Dead people are all on the same level. Gradually, Charlie convinced himself that he was going to have to lead a life of crime to get the money and respect he craved. Just the day before, he had wanted to buy a stuffed toy dog for Carol at the gas station and realized that he didn't even have enough money for that. Even worse, the gas station attendant refused to let him buy the toy on credit. He would get back at these people who turned their noses down at him. He really would. It was well below zero, and the raw Nebraska winds were whipping around mercilessly on that first day of December 1957. It was almost 3 a.m., time to begin what he needed to do. He took with him the 12-gauge shotgun he had lifted from Bob von Busch's cousin and the shells that he had just bought for it, and drove to the gas station that had refused him credit. Robert Culvert, the 21-year-old who had humiliated Charlie the day before, was on duty at the station by himself. He was a short, slender man with a young wife and a baby on the way. Culvert was working on a carburetor when Charlie came into the filling station. He sold him a pack of Camels, and Charlie drove off. A few minutes later, Charlie turned the car around and went back to the station. Culvert was still behind the counter. This time, Charlie bought a pack of gum, got into his car, and drove off again. He parked close by and put on his disguise, a bandana tied over much of his face, and a hunter's hat to cover his red hair. Then Charlie walked back into the station with the loaded shotgun and a canvas bag for the loot. By this time, Culvert was back working on the car and didn't even know anyone was there until he felt the shotgun jabbed into his back. Charlie marched Culvert back to the office and made him open the cash drawer. Charlie scooped up the money and put it in the canvas bag. "Open up the safe," he ordered, but Culvert didn't have the combination. Only the boss knew the combination. Charlie accepted that explanation and decided that he'd just have to make do with the $100 or so that was in the cash drawer. Charlie decided that Culvert was going for a ride. He made the terrified station attendant drive them out toward Bloody Mary's house. Bloody Mary was a crazy old woman who fired a shotgun full of rock salt at anybody who trespassed on her property. Then Charlie made Culvert get out of the car. Later, Charlie said that Culvert struggled with him for the gun and was shot in the scuffle. However, as Culvert tried to get up on his hands and knees, Charlie shot him again, right in the skull. The newspapers made the murder and robbery into a major news event, since there was so little serious crime in that area then. Starkweather took the precaution of painting his car a different color, but then he did some dumb things that called attention to him as a suspect. It was widely reported that most of the loot from the gas station hold-up was in coins, but Charlie used change to buy some clothing for himself. The authorities believed that the hold-up and murder were committed by a transient, so the pressure was off Charlie for the time being. The murder gave Starkweather a feeling of euphoria and peace. He had money. He had a girl. He had killed and not been bothered by it. It gave him an enormous feeling of power. He now operated outside the laws of man. He felt as if he were invisible, could do just as he pleased, take what he wanted. The law was helpless against him. The day after he robbed the gas station and murdered Robert Culvert, Charlie admitted to Carol that he held up the gas station, but that someone else had shot Culvert. She was not fooled, he told people later. The killing created a bond between them that sealed their fate. He seemed to understand that this time together was all that they would have in life before the end. He could grab anything he wanted to give Carol, and the two of them could enjoy that life for at least a little while before their time ran out. It didn't matter that their time was probably very short. What mattered was that they had this time together at all. When the euphoria wore off, Charlie was left with some grim realities. He had been fired from his job as a garbage man. His landlady had locked him out in the freezing cold because he was past due on his rent. Both his family and Carol's family were completely against their relationship and did everything they could to break it up. Carol had put on a little weight, and her family was sure that she was pregnant. He was desperate. On Tuesday afternoon, January 21st, 1958, Starkweather drove over to the squalid dump that Carol and her family called home. The house and the yard were strewn with litter and unused construction materials. Charlie took the .22 caliber rifle he had borrowed and some ammunition to the back door and knocked. Carol's mother, Velda Bartlett, came to the door. What really happened afterward is impossible to confirm. This account is based on Starkweather's recollections after the fact. He claimed that he was carrying the rifle and ammunition in hopes that he could go hunting with Carol's stepfather, Marion Bartlett, with the goal of repairing their relationship. He also brought along 2 discarded carpet samples he found for Velda. According to Charlie, Velda and Marion were both in the house. Their 2.5-year-old child, Betty Jean, was crying. Velda told Charlie they did not want him to see Carol anymore. A loud argument followed, and Velda allegedly hit Charlie a couple of times. He claimed that he left the house without the rifle and drove around for a while before he came back to get the gun. When he came back again, Marion Bartlett literally kicked him out of the door. Starkweather went to a payphone, called Marion Bartlett's place of employment, and told them that he was ill and would not be at work for a couple of days. Then he went back to Carol's house and waited for her to come home from school. When Charlie told Carol what had happened with her parents, she went into the house and argued with her mother. Starkweather followed her into the house. He said that Velda began hitting him again. shrieking that he had made Carol pregnant. He hit Velda back, and they struggled for a few minutes before Charlie got his gun. At that moment, Marion Bartlett came into the room, allegedly with a claw hammer in his hand, and Starkweather shot him in the head. Then Charlie claimed that Velda came at him with a huge knife. Starkweather shot her in the face. As if that was not enough, he rammed the butt of the rifle into her head a couple of times when she tried to get up to reach her baby. Then Charlie hit the baby with the rifle butt. Starkweather said, "I picked up that knife that the old lady had, started to walk into the bedroom, and the little girl kept yelling, and I told her to shut up, and I started to walk again and just turned around and threw the kitchen knife I had at her. They said it hit her in the throat, but I thought it hit her in the chest. I went on into the bedroom. Mr. Bartlett was moving around, so I tried to stab him in the throat, but the knife wouldn't go in, and I just hit the top part of it with my hand, and it went in." Carol's reaction to and role in this slaughter was never satisfactorily determined. Since the only two living witnesses were Charlie and Carol, the real truth may never be known. Carol claimed that she had broken up with Charlie before these tragic events and was terrorized while he attacked her family. What happened after the murder of her family defies belief. Velda's body was dragged to the old outhouse and shoved down the toilet opening. Carol's baby half-sister was put in a box that had been used for garbage and taken out to the outhouse as well. Marion Bartlett was dumped on the floor of the chicken coop. Once that was done, Carol and Charlie cleaned up the blood and mess inside and spent the rest of the evening drinking Pepsi and eating potato chips. They stayed there in the house, just a few yards away from the rotting corpses of Carol's family, for almost a week, buying milk and bread on credit from the milkman every day. Charlie would go down to the grocery store to buy a few other essentials. In the days after the murders, a number of visitors came by the house. Carol turned most of them away with a sign on the front door saying, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu." One day, Marion Bartlett's boss came to the door to see just how sick he was, but Carol came out and told him that her father was still very sick and bedridden. Then, Carol's sister Barbara von Busch and her husband came to visit, but Carol discouraged them both with the story about the flu. They were both suspicious, and later Bob von Busch came back with his brother to investigate. This time the story had changed. In tears, Carol told them they had to leave. "Please don't try to get in. Mom's life will be in your hands if you do." The von Busch brothers went to the police. Later the police showed up and were told by Carol that the family had the flu. When the police asked why her brother-in-law would call the police, Carol told them that Bob von Busch did not get along well with her family. Since Carol seemed sincere and credible and not in any danger, they left. Later, the von Busches were told that there was no reason for alarm. Bob and Barbara sent over one of Carol's close friends, who heard a third story. Carol told her friend in a low whisper, "Some guy is back there with Chuck. He has a Tommy gun. I think they're going to rob a bank." The friend didn't tell the von Busches, but did tell her father, who called the police the next day. Pansy, Carol's grandmother, came over to her daughter's house. Carol seemed to know that her grandmother wasn't going to fall for the flu story, so she embroidered one of the other stories she had made up. "Go home, Grandma. Oh, Granny, go away. Mummy's life is in danger if you don't." Pansy became angry that Carol wouldn't let her in. "If you don't open this door this second, I'm going to go to town and get a search warrant. You've got Chuck in there with you, and don't try to tell me you don't." Carol refused to let her in, and Pansy went to the police. Finally, the police, at Pansy's insistence, made a cursory look inside the house, even though they didn't have a warrant. The house was empty. The police were satisfied that there seemed to be no sign of disorder or violence inside the house. Later that day, Bob von Busch demanded that the police make a thorough search of the property, but they refused. Meanwhile, Guy Starkweather had been trying to get the police to pick up his son for questioning, but he too was refused. Bob von Busch and his brother went out to the Bartlett house and searched the property on their own. One look inside the outhouse and the chicken coop confirmed their worst fears. This time the police paid him some attention. The police bulletin went out to pick up Charlie Starkweather and Carol Fugate. What the police did not appreciate was that this was just the second act of this escalating drama. Once Starkweather and Carol realized that they had better skip town, they also understood that Charlie's car was not going to take them very far. For one thing, the tires were shot. Charlie tried to repair the worst one before they left, but the repair didn't hold, and soon they were looking for a garage. One place they could find temporary refuge was Charlie's 72-year-old family friend, August Meyer. By all accounts, August Meyer was a kindly old bachelor who had known Charlie since he was a boy. Meyer had a farm some 20 miles outside Lincoln where Charlie used to hunt. On January 27th, they pulled onto the dirt track that led to Meyer's farm and immediately got mired in the mud. It is hard to say why exactly, since Carol and Charlie's stories were very contradictory and unsatisfactory, but Charlie shot August Meyer in the head. As in the other murders, Charlie unconvincingly claimed that the killing occurred in self-defense. According to Charlie, Meyer tried to shoot him, and the gun jammed, so Charlie shot back. Then Charlie wounded Meyer's dog as it ran away across the snowy meadow. Charlie carried the body of his old friend into an outbuilding and hid it with a blanket. Then he and Carol went into Meyer's home, stole his money and guns, ate his food, and fell asleep. The next day, a neighbor helped them free their car from the mud, and they drove up to Meyer's farm on a different road. When Charlie checked on the body of his friend, he was spooked by the fact that the blanket was suddenly gone. Fearing discovery, Charlie and Carol took their car down the path in which they first got stuck in the mud. Not surprisingly, the intellectually challenged couple got stuck once again. Taking only their weapons, they left the old Ford where it was. Hiding their shotguns, the two of them hitched a ride from 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old Carol King. Within moments, the shotgun was at Jensen's neck, and Charlie was demanding their money. He forced Jensen to drive back towards Meyer's farm to an abandoned storm cellar. There he put 6 bullets into Jensen's head. Jensen's girlfriend, Carol King, was shot once in the head. Her body was left half naked, with her jeans and panties down around her ankles. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the abdomen and pubic area, but there was no evidence of semen in or around her vagina. While all of this was happening, Carol allegedly was sitting in the car. Charlie attributed the mutilation of King's body to Carol, who supposedly was angry with the dead girl for being attractive sexually to Starkweather. At another time, Charlie claimed that Carol also shot and killed the King girl when he was away from the scene for a few minutes. The bodies of the 2 teenagers were left in the storm cellar while Charlie and Carol took off with Jensen's car. Even though they talked about escaping to Washington State to find refuge with Charlie's brother, they actually did something incredibly dumb. They drove back to Lincoln where everybody knew them and everybody was looking for them. As if that were not stupid enough, they drove past the Bartlett home to see if the bodies of Carol's parents had been discovered. They got their answer when they saw all of the police cars parked around the property. Eventually they drove to the most affluent section of town and fell asleep in their stolen car. The following day, January 28, 1958, Starkweather's car had been spotted in the mud at the Meyer farm. Shortly afterward, the bodies of Meyer and the 2 teenagers were found. A major manhunt was underway, but there was more killing yet to come. Despite his poverty, Charlie was very familiar with the best part of town from his garbage-collecting days. He chose the large home of C. Lauer Ward, a 47-year-old close friend of the governor and president of the Capitol Bridge and Capitol Steel Companies. That morning, Clara Ward, the industrialist's socially prominent wife, and Lillian Fenkel, their hard-of-hearing 51-year-old maid, were home, as were their Chesapeake Bay retriever, Queenie, and their small poodle, Susie. When Lillian Fenkel answered the door, Charlie pointed his gun at her. Carol stayed in the car. He ordered Lillian to lock up Queenie in the basement. Recognizing that the maid had a hearing problem, he wrote her notes to make himself understood. He told her to keep making breakfast for Mrs. Ward. When Clara Ward came into the kitchen, Charlie assured her that nothing bad would happen. Clara was calm and agreed to cooperate. Charlie had Carol come into the house where Mrs. Ward had fixed some coffee for her. Then Carol went into the library and fell asleep. Charlie ordered Clara Ward to fix him some pancakes and serve them to him in the library. When she did so, he changed his mind and had her fix him waffles instead. Still, Mrs. Ward kept her cool and was gracious to Charlie all the while. He exulted in his accomplishment. One of the wealthiest residents of Lincoln was waiting on him, the former garbage man. Around 1 p.m., Clara Ward asked permission to go upstairs and change her shoes. After a few minutes, Charlie went upstairs to see what was keeping her. He claimed that she had armed herself with a .22, shot at him and missed. Charlie threw a knife at her and struck her in the back. He stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and chest. As he dragged Clara's body into the bedroom, Susie started barking at him, so he broke her neck with the butt end of the gun. After killing Clara Ward, Starkweather called his father and told his father to tell Bob von Busch that he was going to kill him for interfering with Charlie's relationship with Carol. Then he sat down to write a letter that was addressed to the law only. It was a twisted, illiterate tirade, confession, and attempt at self-justification. I and Carol are sorry for what has happened because it has hurt everybody, and so has Carol. But I'm saying one thing. Everybody that came out there was lucky they're not dead, even Carol's sister. Later, the two of them loaded the Ward's black 1956 Packard with food and prepared to escape in style. They ransacked the house, taking anything that looked valuable. Around 5:30 p.m., the Lincoln Journal arrived, and Charlie was thrilled. "Hey, Carol, get a load of this. We're stars. Made the front page of the Journal." He had reached his zenith. He was somebody to be reckoned with. A half-hour later, C. Lower Ward came home from work to face the barrel of Starkweather's gun. After a long scuffle, Charlie finally got the upper hand and shot the industrialist dead. Then he turned on Lillian Fenkel. Carol and Charlie tied her to a bed and stabbed her to death. Charlie claimed that Carol killed the maid, while Carol claimed that Charlie did it. Refreshingly, Charlie didn't try to justify the killing this time by claiming the maid attacked him. The next day, Ward's cousin and business associate missed him at work and called the house throughout the morning. Then, around noontime, he went over to the house and let himself in. He found the bodies of Ward and his wife and the maid. Downstairs, Queenie barked furiously, and upstairs, Susie cowered under the bed with a broken neck. Governor Anderson was notified immediately of the savage attack on his friend. Shortly afterward, he called out the National Guard, and they were soon cruising the streets with jeeps armed with mounted machine guns. Parents with guns drawn rushed to the schools and took their children home. The city was completely sealed off. A block-by-block search began. The FBI started an investigation. A $1,000 reward was offered by the mayor. Aircraft were sent up to help look for the Ward's black Packard. And where did these clever outlaws run? Why, back to Carol's parents' house, of course. Yes, they really did. But wisely, they didn't go inside because there was a car in the driveway and the house was lighted up. Somehow, they finally got the message that they could not go back and live at the Bartlett house anymore and headed west towards Washington State. They drove all night and crossed over into Wyoming the next morning, the 29th of January, 1958. Twice they were reported to the police as acting suspiciously, but nothing came of either report. Along the way, they looked for a car to steal and finally came across Merle Collison, a traveling Montana shoe salesman who was sleeping in his Buick parked along the highway. Charlie woke up the salesman to announce that they were going to trade cars, but the shoe salesman apparently didn't agree quickly enough because Charlie shot him a number of times in the head, neck, arm and leg. Since it was a tough stretch of the imagination to expect anyone to believe that Charlie shot Merle Collison in self-defense, Charlie said that Carol did it. With Collison dead in the front passenger seat and Carol in the back, Starkweather started the car but could not figure out how to release the emergency brake. A few minutes later, a young geologist stopped to help the couple, figuring that they had car trouble. "Raise your hands," Charlie told the man, pointing the gun at him. "Help me release the emergency brake or I'll kill you." When the geologist saw the dead man slumped in the passenger seat, he realized that he would have to get the gun away from Starkweather if he wanted to stay alive. While they were struggling, William Romer, a Wyoming deputy sheriff, came by and stopped. Immediately, Carol jumped out of the back seat and ran up to Romer. "Take me to the police," she cried. "Well, I'm a deputy sheriff," he assured her. "He's killed a man," she blurted out, crying and pointing to the car. By this time, Charlie had run to the Packard and was driving back towards the town of Douglas. Romer ordered a roadblock and began his pursuit. Douglas Police Chief Robert Ainsley, who happened to be in his car with Sheriff Earl Heflin of Converse County, Wyoming, received Romer's call. When the Packard raced by them on the road to Douglas, the two men chased it at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Heflin shot out the back window of the Packard with his carbine. Suddenly, Starkweather came to an abrupt halt right in the middle of the highway. The two seasoned lawmen pulled up behind the Packard cautiously and waited until Starkweather got out. They told Charlie to put his hands up, but he didn't, so Ainsley shot the ground near Charlie's feet. This time, Ainsley told him to lie down on the ground, but instead, Charlie reached behind his pants. Thinking that Charlie was reaching for a weapon in his back pocket, Ainsley shot at him again. By this time, Charlie decided to stop tucking in his shirt tail and lay down like he was told to. Why did he suddenly stop? Because he thought he had been shot. In actuality, the bleeding around his ear was a cut from the broken window glass. Heflin was disgusted. He thought he was bleeding to death. That's why he stopped. That's the kind of yellow son of a bitch he is. Yellow or not, he photographed well in a Hollywood kind of way. Bloodied, in chains, shaggy-haired, a cigarette dangling from his lips, wearing his black leather motorcycle jacket, tight black denim pants, blue and white cowboy boots with a butterfly design on the toes, he was a perfect-looking young rebel killer. The first American teenage spree killer caught on camera. From Charlie's perspective, his options were not terribly attractive. He believed that he could go to the gas chamber in Wyoming for the murder of Merle Collison, or he could go to the electric chair in Nebraska for his many killings there. He chose Nebraska, and he and Carol were extradited at the end of January 1958. What he didn't know, and nobody thought to tell him, was that, had he stayed in Wyoming, he probably would have received a life sentence. The Wyoming governor was a death penalty opponent. Carol, meanwhile, maintained that she was a hostage throughout the entire ordeal and that she kept going with Charlie because she feared that he would kill her family if she didn't. The only problem with that story was that she admitted being present for all of the Nebraska murders, including her parents and half-sister. So much for going with Charlie to save her family. Charlie and Carol were both charged with first-degree murder and murder while committing a robbery. Since both were being tried as adults, both faced the prospect of the electric chair. The prosecution chose the murder of Robert Jensen on which to try them, since it had the most potential to shock and outrage the jury. Elmer Scheel was the prosecutor. Charlie's trial began on May 5, 1958. He did nothing to improve his prospects. He maintained that he was completely sane while his lawyers were trying desperately to cobble together the makings of an insanity defense. Nevertheless, his defense lawyers entered a plea of innocent by reason of insanity. To Charlie and his family, the stigma of being insane was worse than the stigma of being a cold-blooded murderer. T. Clement Gaughan and William F. Matulett were appointed by the court to perform the difficult task of defending Charlie. Somehow they had to try to show that Starkweather was completely insane, whereas the prosecutor had an comparatively easy task to demonstrate that Charlie was sane when he robbed and killed Jensen. Initially, Charlie told the authorities that Carol had nothing to do with the crimes. His first words to them on the subject when he was being taken to the jail in Douglas, Wyoming were, "Don't be rough on the girl, she didn't have a thing to do with it." As time went on and Charlie realized that Carol was trying to position herself as an unwilling hostage instead of his girlfriend, he began to implicate her in the crimes. He suggested that she was responsible for several of the murders and all of the mutilations. She could have escaped at any time she wanted, Starkweather said. I left her alone lots of times. Sometimes when I would go in and get hamburgers, she would be sitting in the car with all of the guns. There would have been nothing to stop her from running away. One of the defense attorneys, with a gift for acting, Clement Gorn, made a very emotional plea. This boy is a product of our society. Our society that spawned this individual is looking for a scapegoat. Carol Fugate should get the same punishment as this lad, and I can tell you right now that she is never going to get the death penalty. His life, my life, are almost parallel until our 19th birthday. I stand here and weep unashamedly. I hated everybody and everything, and I could lick anybody. Society treated me exactly as it treated Charles Starkweather, but the good Lord gave me possibly a little better parents. I will take you to the death house so you can see him with his trousers cut to the knees, with his arms bare, his head shaved, with electrodes attached, and when the switch is pulled, you will see the electricity snap and the smoke come from his head, his hair stand on end as the electricity goes through his body. You will see him jerk in the straps and see him fall forward. This is your responsibility, not mine. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you for the life of Charles Starkweather. Unfortunately, Guyon was not Clarence Darrow. Charlie was neither Nathan Leopold nor Dickie Loeb, and there was a jury of 12 people, not just a judge, to make that decision. The jury made its decision within 24 hours, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The men and women of the jury specifically asked for the death penalty. Their request was granted on June 25, 1959. Starkweather was executed in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln, Nebraska, at 12:04 a.m. At Carol's trial, the defense was built upon her being a hostage, forced by Starkweather to go with him on his murder spree. It was not a very credible defense, and she, like Charlie, was found guilty of murder on November 28, 1958. Because she was a 14-year-old girl, she received a life sentence instead of the electric chair. She was sent to the Nebraska Center for Women, where she served her sentence until her parole in June of 1976.
Ray and Faye Copeland aren't the only husband and wife killers, but they may be the most bizarre. Not only did they commit multiple murders together, but they were both eligible for Social Security at the time of their crimes. Little information is readily available, and few studies have been conducted on perpetrators over the age of 60. According to the 2000 Russian Journal of Psychiatry, most elderly murderers demonstrate a close relationship between presenile, senile disorders, and social psychological factors, and more than half demonstrate clear evidence of psychopathology. Another study conducted that same year by the Medical Correctional Authority showed that most of those sent to prison for the first time when 60 or older had committed crimes of passion. Ray and Faye were convicted of killing 5 men, and none of them were crimes of passion. That's not to say that they were in their right minds at the time. Perhaps by looking at the complete picture, we can get a better understanding of what drove them to kill. On August 20th, 1989, the Nebraska Crime Stoppers hotline logged a call from 57-year-old Jack McCormick. He had recently moved from Missouri, where he had witnessed several events that made him fear for his life. He had worked on a farm for an elderly couple named Ray and Faye Copeland, who would use drifters to commit crimes involving the sale of livestock. In the beginning, he was unaware of the illegal activities, but he eventually realized what was going on. McCormick said Mr. Copeland eventually became aware of his suspicions and tried to kill him, which is why he fled. As the conversation came to a close, McCormick mentioned that he had seen several human bones on the farm. Nebraska authorities, while somewhat skeptical of the story, notified detectives in Missouri. Copeland had a long arrest record for forgery and cattle theft, so Missouri authorities took the tip very seriously. They spent the next few months gathering evidence and used McCormick's statements to secure a search warrant. On the morning of October 9, 1989, Sheriff Leland Odell, along with as many as 40 officers, several backhoes, and teams of bloodhounds descended upon the Copeland farm. With such a large area to cover, Odell needed all the help he could get. After spending a week scouring the farm and surrounding property, investigators had not found any evidence to back up McCormick's story. Some were beginning to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Nonetheless, on October 17, 1989, all doubts were put to rest. Investigators discovered 3 bodies in a local barn Ray Copeland was known to use. Each one was buried in a separate grave, and they were later identified as 21-year-old Paul Jason Cowart from Dardanelle, Arkansas, 27-year-old John W. Freeman from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and 27-year-old Jimmy Dale Harvey from Springfield, Missouri. All 3 had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the skull. The following week, investigators searched another barn Ray was known to use. More than a dozen deputies and volunteers spent several hours removing 2,000 bales of hay, which was stacked ceiling high. Investigators discovered a body wrapped in black plastic beneath the barn floor. The victim had also been killed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. He was later identified as Wayne Warner, age unknown. During a search of Ray's home, investigators seized a .22 caliber Marlin bolt-action rifle. According to the Kansas City Star, ballistic tests later revealed it was the weapon used in each murder. Investigators also discovered a handwritten list of farm helpers in Faye's writing. 12 of the names had scrawled X's by them. 5 of those men turned up dead, and investigators suspected that the others, who turned out to be missing, were also dead. In addition, they also found a quilt which Faye had made from the clothing of the murdered men. As the search began to wind down, investigators made one final discovery. While examining an old well close to where Warner's body was found, they discovered the body of another man. He was later identified as 27-year-old Dennis Murphy. As with the others, his death resulted from a single bullet to the back of the head. Prosecutors were quick to offer Faye Copeland a deal. If she were to tell investigators where more bodies might be found, they would only charge her with conspiracy to commit murder, and she would serve a few months in jail for her cooperation. Regardless, Faye claimed to have no knowledge of any of the murders. Both Ray and Faye Copeland were arraigned on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors did not want to take any chances, and Ray was taken to a state mental hospital for evaluation. The last thing the state wanted was an insanity defense. The public defender's office knew it would be hard to defend the couple together, so they filed for a motion to have the cases tried separately. No one knew for certain which direction the trial would take, but everyone suspected Faye would have a better chance on her own. The prosecution was playing hardball, and rather than life in prison, they were seeking the death penalty in both cases. Ray Copeland was born in Oklahoma during 1914, just as World War I was beginning in Europe. Ray's parents, Jess and Laney Copeland, moved around frequently as he was growing up and eventually settled in Ozark Hills, Arkansas. By this time, Ray's mother had given birth to a daughter and another son. Following the conflict in Europe, the Great Depression began. In order to survive, every person had to contribute to the family's survival. Ray was no exception, and during his 4th grade of schooling, he dropped out to help with the family's small farm. Little is known about Ray's adolescent years, but friends of the family later described him to Miller as stubborn and insubordinate. Ray's life of crime started at the age of 20, when he stole 2 hogs from his father and sold them in another town. His father later found out, but no formal charges were ever filed. For the next several years, Ray continued to commit petty thefts. The majority of his illegal activities revolved around the theft of livestock, but he eventually started to commit more serious crimes. In 1936, he was arrested in Harrison, Arkansas, and charged with forging government checks. He was later sentenced to 1 year in the county jail. After serving out his sentence, Ray moved back to his parents' farm. There's no public record of his activities for the next 3 years, so he either managed to stay out of trouble during this time, or he was more careful in the crimes he chose to commit. Things began to look up for Ray during the spring of 1940. During a routine visit to a physician's office, he met a young girl named Faye Della Wilson. The fair-haired 19-year-old was the daughter of Rufus and Gladys Wilson, a hard-working couple from Harrison, Arkansas. Faye's parents had very little money, but they did manage to raise 7 children in a dirt floor cabin. Ray and Faye quickly hit it off,
and less than 6 months later, they were married. Within a year of their nuptials, the couple had a boy, whom they named Everett. 2 years later, Fay gave birth to another child, Billy Ray. In 1944, Ray decided to move his growing family to Fresno County, California. The following year, the couple's first and only girl, Betty Lou, was born. 2 years later, in 1947, the couple's third son, Alvia, was born. In 1949, Ray was accused of stealing horses from a local farmer. No charges were filed, but Ray's reputation was severely damaged. Later that same year, Fay gave birth to the couple's fifth child, William Wayne. Due to suspected horse thefts, Ray was unable to find steady work, so he eventually moved his family back to Arkansas. The Copelands were in Arkansas for less than a month when Ray was arrested for cattle theft. Charged with grand larceny, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in jail. Upon his release from prison, Ray moved his family to Rocky Comfort, Missouri. The change in scenery did not help, and in 1951, Ray was again arrested for cattle theft. He was sentenced to manual labor on the judge's farm. In 1953, Ray moved his family to Illinois. Over the next 8 years, the Copelands moved from town to town, and Ray was arrested on at least 3 separate occasions for writing bad checks. Fines and jail time did little to deter Ray, and he continued to dabble in illegal activities. In 1961, Ray paid for 20 head of cattle with a $2,960 check. The seller soon discovered the check was no good, and Ray was arrested and sentenced to 9 months behind bars. Directly after his release, Ray passed another bad check during the purchase of 19 head of cattle. He was again arrested and sentenced to another 9 months in jail. After his last stint in jail, Ray finally came to the realization that something needed to change. He was spending more time as a prisoner than he was a free man. Unfortunately, rather than change his actions, he ultimately decided he needed to change his methods. He needed to formulate a new game plan, and he decided to go straight until he could figure out the details. During the summer of 1966, Ray decided it was time to move once again, and he took his family to Missouri. The following year, the Copeland clan purchased a small farm with 40 acres of land. They paid $6,000 for their new home, which was located in Mooresville, Missouri. They were in desperate need of money, so Fay took a job at Midwest Quality Gloves Corporation. Over the course of the next several years, many of Ray's neighbors began to loathe him. They viewed him as a penny-pinching old man, and several suspected he beat his wife and children. His wife and kids would verify these suspicions many years later. Ray had a keen eye for cattle, and he knew a good deal when he saw one. His only problem was he never had any money. As the old saying goes, it takes money to make money. So by the early 1970s, Ray began working out the details of his new plan. He knew he could not continue writing bad checks. He never got away with it in the past, and the last thing he wanted was to be sent back to jail. His arrest record was long enough, and another arrest could send him away for a substantial period of time. No, he knew he could not risk doing that himself, but then he wondered if he could convince someone else to do it for him. Someone no one knew, and someone who could disappear without rousing any suspicion. The plan needed some work, but he was certain he had stumbled onto something feasible. Once Ray worked out the details, he began showing up at cattle auctions with hitchhikers and drifters. The two men would sit on opposite sides of each other during the sales, and Ray would signal whenever he wanted a particular group of livestock. When it came time to complete the purchase, Ray would have the man write out a check from Ray's book and sign his name to it. The check would eventually bounce, but by then, Ray would already have sold the cattle. When law enforcement confronted him about the checks, Ray would pretend to have no knowledge of the sales and would proclaim his innocence by pointing out the signatures on the checks were not in his handwriting. Hence, no charges could be filed against him. The scam was not very sophisticated, but surprisingly, he was able to pull it off dozens of times. Ray used several different drifters, and all of them would disappear after the sales. Ray felt he had formulated the perfect plan, but he did not count on the determination of local law enforcement to prove his involvement in the cattle scams. Investigators eventually caught up with one of the drifters. The man, Gerald Perkins, was cooperative with detectives, and he provided them with a detailed account of Ray's schemes. Ray was quickly arrested and ended up serving almost 2 years in jail for check forgery. After his release from prison, Ray managed to stay out of trouble for several years. He still felt his plan was successful, if in need of some minor adjustments. By the mid-1980s, Ray had fine-tuned his last scheme and was eagerly putting it into operation. He would still use drifters, the only difference being he would not have them write checks from his account. Instead, he would have them get a post office box and open an account in their own name and have them write checks from their own account at various livestock auctions. Ray would explain this to them by saying the auctioneers disliked him and would not give him a fair shake. Once the drifter wore out his welcome, Ray would see to it that he disappeared for good. On November 1st, 1990, 69-year-old Faye Copeland went to trial. According to articles in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Faye's defense was that her husband had committed the killings without her knowledge. She claimed she was both a bystander and a victim of battered woman syndrome. As evidence of her guilt, prosecutors presented the list and quilt discovered during a search of the farm. The jury found her guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death by lethal injection for 4 of the counts and life without parole for the 5th. Upon hearing her sentence, Faye Copeland sobbed uncontrollably. The morning after Faye's verdict, a sheriff involved in the case was transporting Ray Copeland to a Kansas City hospital for another mental examination. During the trip, the sheriff began questioning Ray about Faye's trial. "You hear about the verdict, Ray?" "Nah, what happened?" "Well, they found her guilty and recommended execution for her, Ray." "Well, those things happen to some you know," he responded. Ray never asked about Faye again. On March 7, 1991, 76-year-old Ray Copeland went to trial. After weeks of testimony and the admittance of the prosecution's ballistic test results, a jury of his peers found him guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was then sentenced to death by lethal injection. Upon hearing the verdict, Ray simply mumbled, "I'm okay." Ray and Faye Copeland became the oldest couple in American history ever sentenced to death. 2 years later, while awaiting execution at the Potosi Correctional Center, 78-year-old Ray Copeland died. To this day, many investigators believe Ray was responsible for other murders, which have yet to be discovered. On August 6, 1999, U.S. District Judge Ortree Smith overturned the death sentence for 78-year-old Faye Copeland. Faye's attorney was quoted by the Columbia Daily Tribune as saying, "The evidence of Faye's guilt was pretty thin. Faye just happened to be there. She worked in the greenhouse at the prison every day. She wouldn't hurt a fly. I think you can ask the warden, and he would say he could open the door and there wouldn't be a danger to anybody." Faye's attorney filed the appeal because the Livingston County jury that convicted her was not allowed to hear evidence of battered woman syndrome. Even though the death penalty was no longer an issue, the judge allowed her murder convictions to stand, and she was ordered to remain in prison for the rest of her life. Several women's activist groups began to protest Faye's imprisonment, claiming she had suffered enough and that she presented no threat to society. But their requests to commute her sentence to time served fell upon deaf ears. 2 weeks after her sentencing, Faye Copeland gave a rare interview to Lee Kavanaugh of the Kansas City Star. The following are excerpts from that interview. "I couldn't have flowers at home. He didn't like me to be tending to anything other than him. As long as I was with him, or working the cattle or the tractor, that was okay. But flowers? No, he didn't like them. I was raised to love my husband and support him no matter what. The man is the head of the family. The Bible says it should be that way. It wouldn't do to say if Ray was mean to me or not. Yes, he did mess up my life, but that's not to say that I wasn't a good wife to him. I was never mean to him. Maybe we'd have got along better if I'd knocked the shit out of him a few times. I've often thought since, maybe this was for the best. Where did I go wrong, if I went wrong? I know one place was getting married at all, but he was my life for many, many years. I didn't know anything else. Will I get out? I may go out feet first, but I'll get out of here someday." In November of 2000, Missouri Attorney General Jay Nixon appealed Judge Smith's ruling and asked the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals to reinstate Faye's death sentence. But the Federal Appeals Court upheld the decision. Faye remained quiet during most of the proceedings, but when asked if she had anything to say, she stood up, stating at that hearing, "I think I've paid for what I did, or what I knew. God will forgive me for anything I've said or done." Afterward, Faye's son, Al Copeland, spoke briefly with the Associated Press and said he had been pressing for his mother's release since she was imprisoned. "There's no way in the world Mum could have done what they said she had done," he said. But in regards to his father, Al said, "He was guilty. I have no qualms about that." The following month, Tom and Jeanette Block, founders of Missourians Against State Killing, or MASK, began fighting to have Faye released from prison. They desperately sought the public's help and requested the people send letters of support for Faye. During this time, this author contacted the group and later received the following reply. "While we are grateful that Faye is out of danger of execution, we are disappointed that she will remain in prison for the rest of her life. We have an application for clemency pending before Governor Wilson, asking that he commute her sentence to time served. I have attached a copy of the petition. Anyone interested in helping could write and urge the governor to grant our petition. Thanks for your support. Sean D. O'Brien, Public Interest Litigation Clinic." On August 10, 2002, Faye Copeland suffered a stroke, which left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Weeks later, she was paroled to a nursing home in her hometown. The following year, on December 30, 2003, 82-year-old Faye Copeland died at the Morningside Center nursing home from what Livingston County Coroner Scott Lindsay described as natural causes. Faye finally gained freedom, even if it was feet first.